The dirt was still settling when the messenger arrived. He came running, breathless, his tunic darkened with sweat, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes not from what has happened, but from what is about to happen. He found her in the courtyard, overseeing the daily work, her hands steady as she directed the servants in their tasks. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and something in his expression made her pause. "My lady," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to die tonight." The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them the household continued its rhythm, unaware that their world was about to change. She stood perfectly still, her mind already moving through possibilities, through outcomes, through the narrow space between disaster and deliverance. "Tell me everything," she said. "Some of the greatest acts of faith are not miracles, they are interruptions. They are moments when wisdom steps between anger and violence, when a single voice speaks into chaos and changes the trajectory of destruction. They are the quiet interventions that history barely remembers, but heaven never forgets. This is the story of such a moment, a story of a woman whose name means Father's Joy, who would become the joy of a future king and the salvation of an entire household. A story of how God sometimes works not through force or supernatural display, but through the steady courage of someone willing to act when everyone else has given up hope. Her name was Abigail, and this is how she stopped a war. Chapter 1. David on the Run. The wilderness of Paran was not a place for living. It was a place for hiding. David had been here for months now, moving through the rocky terrain with his men, 600 souls who had left everything to follow him. They were outcasts, debtors, refugees from King Saul's increasingly paranoid regime. They lived in caves and makeshift camps, always moving, always watching the horizon for dust clouds that might signal pursuing soldiers. But they were not bandits. David had made that clear from the beginning. They would not steal, would not raid, would not become the lawless mob that Saul claimed they were. Instead, they had found another way to survive. The shepherds knew them well. When flocks grazed in the remote areas, when caravans moved through dangerous territory, David's men were there. They formed a protective barrier against raiders and wild animals. They asked for nothing in return, operating on the ancient principle of hospitality that bound desert communities together. You protected your neighbour's property. In turn, when times were hard, your neighbour would provide. It was not a perfect system, but it kept them alive. David himself had changed in the wilderness. The young shepherd who had killed Goliath seemed like a distant memory now. The warrior who had sung songs in Saul's court, who had won the love of the people with his victories against the Philistines, who had married the king's daughter, all of that belonged to another life. The anointed future king lived like a fugitive, his crown still years away, his present reality defined by survival and faith that God's promises would somehow eventually come true. He sat now near a fire watching the sun set over the wilderness, his lieutenant standing nearby. The camp stretched out around them, rough shelters clustered between rocks, women tending cooking fires, children playing in the dust. These people had followed him into uncertainty. They trusted him to keep them safe, to make decisions that would preserve their lives and their dignity. "The shearing season has begun," the lieutenant said. "Nabal's flocks are coming down from the hills." David nodded slowly. Nabal. The name was well known throughout the region. A wealthy landowner whose prosperity stood in stark contrast to David's poverty. A man whose shepherds had grazed safely for months because David's men had protected them. "We've lost 3 men this month," David said quietly. 2 to fever, 1 to a fall. "Our supplies are nearly gone. The grain we stored is running low. The women are rationing water. We can't continue like this much longer." "Nabal has prospered because of us," the lieutenant replied. "His shepherds have told him. They've spoken about how we kept watch, how we drove off the raiders from the north, how not a single animal was lost while we were in the area. He knows what we've done." David stared into the fire, watching the flames dance against the gathering darkness. The wilderness had taught him many things: patience, humility, the difference between the appearance of power and the reality of it. He had once commanded armies. Now he commanded a ragged band of fugitives. He had once lived in palaces. Now he lived in caves. He had once been celebrated. Now he was hunted. But through it all, he had maintained his honour. He had refused to raise his hand against Saul even when given the opportunity. He had protected the innocent. He had kept his word. He had trusted that God's anointing meant something, even when every circumstance suggested otherwise. He had never begged before. Even in his darkest moments fleeing from Saul, he had maintained his dignity, trusted that provision would come. But his men were hungry. Their families were hungry. Children were beginning to show the gaunt faces of malnutrition. And the tradition of desert hospitality was clear. Those who benefited from protection owed those who provided it. "Send messengers in the morning," David said finally. 10 men. Choose them carefully. Men who know how to speak with respect, who won't let pride get in the way of necessity. Have them greet Nabal with all appropriate honour. Remind him of our service to his shepherds. Remind him that we come at a time of celebration, when giving is expected. Ask him for whatever he can spare during this time of abundance." The lieutenant nodded, understanding the delicacy of the situation. They were not demanding tribute. They were not threatening. They were simply invoking the ancient codes that governed survival in the wilderness. "We protected you. Now, in your time of plenty, share with us in our time of need." "And remind them," David added, his voice firm, "we go as friends. We ask as those who have earned the right to ask, but we ask with honour. We are not thieves. We are not beggars. We are men who have served and now request the hospitality that service has earned." The lieutenant turned to leave, then paused. "And if he refuses?" David was quiet for a long moment. "He won't refuse. No one refuses such a request. It would violate every custom, every tradition. It would mark him as a man without honour, without decency. No one is that foolish." But even as he said the words, something in his chest tightened. The wilderness had taught him that people could be more foolish than anyone imagined, that pride could override wisdom, that wealth could blind people to obligation. He pushed the thought away. Nabal would do the right thing. The request was reasonable. The service had been real. The hospitality codes were ancient and binding. Everything would be fine. Neither of them could have known that by morning everything would change, that a man's arrogance would light a fuse that would burn through the night, that 400 swords would be drawn in anger, that death would begin its march toward an unsuspecting household, and that a woman named Abigail was about to step between fury and vengeance with nothing but words and wisdom and desperate courage. The fire crackled. The stars emerged. The wilderness settled into its nightly rhythms, and in the distance, in a wealthy estate lit with celebration, a man named Nabal lifted his cup and laughed, completely unaware that he was about to make the worst decision of his life. Chapter 2. A wealthy man named Nabal. Nabal's estate sprawled across the hillside, like a small kingdom unto itself. Stone walls, expertly constructed and well-maintained, enclosed courtyards where servants moved with the practiced efficiency of those who knew their places and their duties. Storage rooms, built deep into the hillside to keep grain and oil cool, overflowed with the surplus of years of profitable shepherding. Pens held thousands of sheep and goats, their wool the source of Nabal's considerable wealth, their meat a symbol of his abundance. The main house rose 3 stories, an architectural statement in a region where most people lived in simple dwellings. Windows looked out over terraced gardens where pomegranate trees grew heavy with fruit. Cisterns, carefully engineered to capture every drop of precious rainwater, ensured that even in drought years Nabal's household never went thirsty. Everything about the estate spoke of success, of shrewd management, of a man who had built something substantial in a hard land. But wealth, as the wise know, does not guarantee wisdom. And success does not necessarily produce goodness. The shearing season was Nabal's favourite time of year. It was more than just business. It was a festival, a celebration, an opportunity to display his prosperity to everyone around him. For weeks, workers had been preparing. Pens had been constructed for sorting the flocks. Fires had been built for roasting meat. Musicians had been hired from towns as far away as Hebron. Wine had been brought up from the cellars in quantities that made even experienced stewards raise their eyebrows. Merchants came from distant regions, drawn by the reputation of Nabal's festivities. Local officials made appearances, knowing that their presence would be noted and that Nabal's goodwill, or lack of it, could affect their standing in the community. Business associates gathered to make deals, to forge connections, to participate in the complex dance of commerce that the shearing season represented, and at the centre of it all sat Nabal himself. He was a heavy man, his expensive robes straining across a belly that spoke of years of excess. His fingers were adorned with rings that caught the lamplight, each one a small fortune, each one a symbol of his status. His face was flushed, not just from wine, but from the permanent ruddiness of someone who ate and drank too much too often. His voice carried across the courtyard, loud with boasting, harsh with commands, quick to mock anyone he deemed inferior, which, in Nabal's estimation, was nearly everyone. His name itself was telling. Nabal meant fool in Hebrew, and whether it was a name given at birth or a description that had stuck, it fit him with uncomfortable accuracy. He was the kind of fool who mistakes wealth for wisdom, who confuses possessions with worth, who believes that because he has succeeded in business, he has succeeded in life. People feared him because he controlled resources. They obeyed him because he paid their wages. They served him because they had families to feed. But no one loved him. No one respected him in the way that mattered. And Nabal, insulated by his wealth and his arrogance, never noticed or never cared about the difference. His wife entered the courtyard quietly, moving along the periphery where the shadows were deepest. Abigail was as different from her husband as light from shadow, as music from noise, as wisdom from folly. Where Nabal was loud, she was thoughtful. Where he was harsh, she was kind. Where he demanded respect through fear and wealth, she earned it through wisdom and grace and genuine care for those around her. The servants loved her. When they faced difficulties, they came to Abigail, not Nabal. When problems arose in the household, she solved them before they could escalate. When conflicts threatened to tear apart the delicate social fabric of a large estate, she smoothed them over with diplomatic skill that would have made a king's counsellor envious. Even the shepherds, rough. Men who spent months in the wilderness with the flocks, men who had little patience for the games of the wealthy, spoke of her with something approaching reverence. She remembered their names. She asked about their families. She ensured that their wages were paid fairly and on time, often having to argue with Nabal to make it happen. She treated them like human beings rather than tools to be used and discarded. How she had come to marry Nabal remained a source of speculation and quiet tragedy. Some whispered of family arrangements made when she was too young to have a voice in the matter. Others spoke of economic necessities, of a father who needed an alliance with Nabal's wealth, of a young woman sacrificed on the altar of family prosperity. Still others simply shook their heads at the unfairness of it all. A woman of such quality bound to a man of such cruelty. For Nabal was cruel, not in dramatic, obvious ways that would bring judgment from the community. His cruelty was more subtle, more grinding. He cheated his workers of small amounts they couldn't prove. He mocked those who asked for help, turning genuine need into a source of entertainment. He hoarded his wealth like a dragon guards gold, giving nothing unless absolutely forced, seeing generosity not as virtue but as weakness to be exploited. He treated his servants with contempt, his associates with suspicion, his neighbours with disdain. The only thing he seemed to love was his wealth, and even that love was possessive and fearful. The love of someone who knows deep down that everything he has could be taken away, and that without it, he would be revealed as having nothing of real value. Abigail watched him now from across the courtyard, holding court among the merchants and officials, his voice rising and falling in stories designed to showcase his cleverness and success. She knew these stories. She had heard them dozens of times. They were always the same, tales of deals where he had outsmarted someone, negotiations where he had gotten the better end, situations where his cunning had prevailed over others' naivete. It never seemed to occur to him that these stories made him look small rather than clever, that boasting about taking advantage of others revealed more about his character than it concealed. That true respect came not from outwitting people but from dealing with them honourably. A steward approached her, his face troubled. "My lady, one of the chief shepherds asked to speak with the master earlier today about David's men." Abigail's attention sharpened. "David? The one who killed Goliath, the one King Saul is hunting. Apparently his men have been in the wilderness near our flocks for months. The shepherd wanted to tell the master that they've been protecting the flocks, keeping raiders away, helping find lost animals. And what did my husband say?" The steward's expression told her everything before he spoke. He dismissed it, said he doesn't owe anything to some outlaw, said the shepherd was just trying to make excuses for not doing his job properly. A cold weight settled in Abigail's stomach. She knew the stories of David. Everyone did. The young hero who had killed the Philistine champion when Israel's armies cowered in fear. The warrior whose victories had made the people sing songs comparing him favourably to King Saul himself. The anointed one whom the prophet Samuel had blessed in secret, setting in motion a conflict that had turned David from favoured son to hunted fugitive. A man like that, driven to desperation, leading 600 armed men in the wilderness, could be very dangerous indeed. "Did the shepherd seem concerned?" she asked quietly. "Terrified, my lady. He said David's men are honourable, that they've been nothing but helpful. But he seemed worried about what might happen if your husband handles this wrong." Abigail nodded slowly. She could imagine exactly how Nabal would handle it, with arrogance, with dismissal, with the kind of casual cruelty that he thought demonstrated strength, but actually revealed nothing but foolishness. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Keep me informed if you hear anything else." The steward bowed and retreated, leaving Abigail standing in the shadows, a small worry beginning to grow in the back of her mind. She had learned to trust these worries. They were often the first sign that something needed attention, that a crisis was forming just below the surface of normalcy. But what could she do? Nabal was her husband. This was his estate, his business, his decision. She had influence in the household, yes, but that influence had limits. She could not override him publicly. She could not contradict him in front of others. She could not force him to see reason when he was convinced he didn't need it. So she did what she had learned to do over years of marriage to a fool. She watched. She waited. She prepared herself for whatever crisis might be coming. And in the courtyard, Nabal lifted his cup again, his laughter echoing off the stone walls, completely oblivious to the storm that was already forming in the wilderness, already heading toward his comfortable, prosperous, carefully constructed world. The celebration continued. The wine flowed. The music played. And in the distance 10 men were making their way through the darkness, carrying a simple request that would change everything. Chapter 3. The Request That Sparks Anger. The messengers arrived at midday when the sun was high and the shearing celebration was reaching its peak. The courtyard was a controlled chaos of activity. Wool was being sorted and bundled. Sheep were being marked and counted. Meat was roasting over open fires, filling the air with smoke and the rich smell of celebration. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and loosening judgment in equal measure. There were 10 of them, chosen carefully by David's lieutenant for their ability to speak with diplomacy, their understanding of protocol, their capacity to represent David with honour. They were not the roughest of David's men, not the fighters who spent their days training with weapons and their nights standing guard. These were men who understood nuance, who could navigate the delicate social structures that governed interactions between the powerful and the petitioning. They wore their best clothing, which admittedly wasn't much. Months in the wilderness had taken their toll. Their tunics were clean but worn. Their sandals were well made but showed the marks of hard travel. They carried no weapons openly, though each man had a knife at his belt, not as threat but as the simple necessity of life in dangerous territory. They found Nabal exactly where they expected, at the centre of the activity, supervising the shearing with the kind of micromanagement that suggested he trusted no one to do anything properly. He was shouting instructions at workers who had been shearing sheep for decades, correcting techniques that needed no correction, asserting his authority in ways that were more about demonstrating power than actually improving the work. The eldest messenger, a man named Eliam, who had once served in Saul's court and knew how to navigate the egos of the powerful, stepped forward. He waited for a pause in Nabal's tirade. then spoke with the formal courtesy that the situation demanded. "Peace be to you, and peace to your house, and peace to all that you have." The greeting was significant. It was the traditional opening for a request based on mutual respect and shared community. It acknowledged Nabal's status as a man of substance. It positioned the messengers as equals in dignity, if not in wealth. It set the tone for an interaction between honourable men conducting honourable business. Around the courtyard, activity slowed as people turned to watch. Strangers arriving with formal greetings was unusual enough to merit attention. The quality of Nabal's response would say much about his character, his wisdom, his understanding of the social obligations that bound desert communities together. Eliam continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced clarity. "We come from David, son of Jesse, who sends his greetings in friendship and respect. Your shepherds have been with us in the wilderness during these past months, and we wish you to know that we did them no harm. Nothing of theirs went missing during the entire time they were in our territory. We treated them as brothers, and they can testify to this truth." He paused, allowing the words to register. Several of Nabal's shepherds standing at the edges of the courtyard nodded vigorously. It was true, more than true. One of them, a weathered man named Caleb who had spent 40 years tending flocks, stepped forward slightly, emboldened by the public acknowledgement. "Master, it's all true," Caleb said. "David's men were like a wall around us, day and night. When raiders came down from the north, they drove them off before we even knew we were in danger. When lions threatened the flocks, they were there. We never lost a single animal while they were nearby. They shared their watchfires with us, warned us of dangers, helped us find strays. They asked for nothing in return, just protected us, like we were their own people." Other shepherds murmured agreement. The testimony was powerful because it was genuine. These were not men prone to exaggeration or sentiment. They were practical, hard men who dealt in facts. And the fact was that David's presence in the wilderness had made their dangerous work safer than it had been in years. Eliam nodded his thanks to Caleb, then turned back to Nabal. "Therefore, let our young men find favour in your eyes, for we come on a feast day, a time of celebration and abundance. We ask that you give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David." The phrasing was deliberate and respectful. Your son David was an expression of humility, positioning David as someone seeking Nabal's paternal goodwill, rather than demanding payment for services. Whatever you find at hand suggested they were not making specific demands, but trusting Nabal's generosity to determine an appropriate response. The mention of it being a feast day invoked the ancient tradition that times of celebration were times for sharing with those in need. The request was perfectly calibrated. It was humble without being servile. It was specific about the relationship while being flexible about the response. It invoked tradition while allowing Nabal the dignity of choosing how to fulfill his obligation. It was, in short, exactly the kind of request that a wise and generous man would be honoured to receive and grateful to fulfill. The courtyard had gone completely quiet. Workers had stopped to listen. Even the music had faded. Everyone waited for Nabal's response, understanding that this was a moment that would reveal much about their master's character. What they got was laughter. Not the warm laughter of genuine amusement. Not the polite laughter of social lubrication. This was harsh, mocking laughter that echoed off the stone walls like the cawing of crows. Laughter designed to humiliate. Laughter that turned a respectful request into something ridiculous and contemptible. Nabal's face had flushed an even deeper red, though whether from wine or anger or simple mean-spiritedness was impossible to say. He looked at the messengers with the kind of disdain usually reserved for the lowest beggars, for people so beneath notice that acknowledging them was itself an act of condescension. "Who is David?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. The question hung in the air like an insult. Who is this son of Jesse? The phrasing was deliberate. By refusing to acknowledge David by his title or reputation, by reducing him to son of Jesse as if he were nobody, Nabal was delivering a calculated insult. He was saying, "I know exactly who you're talking about, and I consider him beneath my notice." "Every day," Nabal continued, his voice rising so that everyone in the courtyard could hear, Slaves are breaking away from their masters. Servants are running off, thinking they can become something they're not. Should I take my bread and my water and the meat I've slaughtered for my own shearers and give it to men who come from who knows where? To some rabble following a runaway? The insult was multi-layered and devastating. He was calling David a runaway slave. He was denying the legitimacy of David's anointing, his service to Saul, his victories for Israel. He was reducing David's 600 men, many of whom were skilled warriors, all of whom had shown honour in their protection of Nabal's property, to nameless rabble, to nobodies not worth considering. He was also, whether he realised it or not, denying the testimony of his own shepherds, the men who had just confirmed David's service, the men who had benefited from that service, the men whose grateful words he was now dismissing as irrelevant to his decision. Eliam's face had gone very still. The other messengers stood frozen, processing what had just happened. They had been prepared for many possible responses, negotiation, counter-offers, perhaps even a polite refusal based on claimed scarcity. But this level of contempt, this deliberate, calculated insult. "You can tell your master," Nabal continued, his voice thick with wine and arrogance, "that I know exactly who he is. A fugitive running from King Saul, an outlaw living in caves, a man the real king of Israel has condemned as a traitor. Why would I honour such a person with my resources? Why would I dignify his begging by responding to it?" He waved his hand dismissively, the gesture of someone brushing away an insect. "Now get out of my sight, go back to your caves and your pathetic existence and tell David that Nabal of Maon knows exactly what he is. Nothing." The messengers turned and left without another word. There was nothing to say, no response that wouldn't escalate the situation further, no argument that would penetrate arrogance this thick. They walked through the courtyard gates in silence, their backs straight despite the humiliation, their faces carefully controlled despite the fury beginning to build in their chests. Behind them, Nabal had already turned back to the shearing, already moved on to shouting at workers about some trivial imperfection in their work. The insult had cost him nothing. It had been in his mind simply putting presumptuous beggars in their place. He did not notice the expressions on his shepherds' faces, did not see Caleb shaking his head in disbelief and fear, did not register the way his own workers were looking at each other with worry and dread. But Abigail noticed. She had been in one of the storage rooms when the messengers arrived, working with several servants to inventory supplies. She had heard the formal greeting, had moved closer to listen, had felt hope rising that perhaps this would go well, that perhaps her husband would surprise her by acting with wisdom and generosity. And then she had heard the laughter, had heard the insults, had watched the messengers walk away with the kind of controlled fury that spoke of violence being barely restrained. She stood very still, her mind already racing through implications and possibilities. This was bad. This was very, very bad. David was not some powerless beggar. He was a warrior who had killed giants and led armies. He was desperate, yes, but desperation made men dangerous, not weak. He had 600 armed men who had just heard their leader insulted in the most profound way possible. And Nabal, drunk and arrogant and completely lacking in wisdom, had just guaranteed that those 600 men would want blood. One of the shepherds, the one named Caleb, caught her eye. He moved toward her slowly, his face grave. When he was close enough to speak without being overheard, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My lady, we need to talk. Privately. Right now." Abigail glanced toward the courtyard where Nabal was still holding court, still celebrating, still completely oblivious to what he had just set in motion. "Come with me," she said quietly. They moved deeper into the storage areas, away from the celebration, away from listening ears. And there, in the shadows among the grain and oil, Caleb told her what she already suspected but needed confirmed. "He's doomed us all," Caleb said, his voice shaking with fear and anger. "David will come. Before dawn, he'll come. And when he does, none of us will survive." Abigail listened as Caleb explained what David's men had done for them in the wilderness, how they had protected the flocks, how they had shared their food and their fires, how they had asked for nothing and given everything, How the request that Nabal had just mocked and refused was not just reasonable but understated compared to what they had actually earned. They were good to us, my lady, better than we deserved. They treated us like family. And now your husband has called their leader a runaway slave, has denied his honour, has mocked his men as rabble. David won't let this stand. He can't. Not if he wants to maintain any authority over his men. Not if he wants to show that insulting him comes with consequences. How much time do we have? Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the fear beginning to bloom in her chest. If they left immediately after our messengers returned, they could be here by midnight, maybe sooner if they force march. My lady, you have to understand, these are not bandits who fight for plunder. These are warriors who fight for honour, and your husband just shredded David's honour in front of everyone. There's no negotiating with that kind of anger, there's only blood. Abigail's mind was already moving, already calculating, already running through options. She could not appeal to Nabal. He was drunk and would remain drunk through the night. He would not listen to reason, would not accept that he had done anything wrong, would not believe that consequences could touch him in his wealth and power. She could not send more messengers. After what had just happened, more words would only fuel the fire. She could not warn the household and cause a panic that would accomplish nothing. They had nowhere to run, no safe place to go, no way to escape warriors who knew the wilderness far better than wealthy estate workers. No, if this was to be stopped, it would require something radical, something unprecedented, something that might get her killed but was better than the certainty of death if she did nothing. It would require her to go to David herself, to ride into the darkness, to face an angry man with an army at his back, to speak words that might turn away wrath before it consumed everything she was trying to protect. Caleb, she said, her voice firm despite the terror trying to take hold, I need you to do exactly what I say. Go to the storerooms, begin gathering supplies quietly, bread, as much as you can carry, wine, the best we have, 5 dressed sheep from the ones already prepared for the feast, roasted grain, raisins, fig cakes, enough for 400 men to eat well. His eyes widened. My lady, that's enough to show David that not everyone in this household shares Nabal's contempt, enough to demonstrate respect that my husband refused to give, enough to possibly save all our lives. But if the master finds out, if my husband finds out, I'll already be dead along with everyone else. Caleb, we don't have time for fear. We have work to do. She turned to another servant who had been listening, a young woman named Rachel who had served in the household since childhood. Rachel, prepare my fastest donkey. Make sure the path toward the wilderness is clear, and do it quietly. No one can know what we're doing until it's done. Rachel nodded and hurried off. Caleb stood for a moment longer, looking at Abigail with something like awe and terror mixed together. My lady, you're going to ride out alone? To meet an army of angry men in the middle of the night? I'm going to try to save this household, Abigail said quietly. Because someone has to. Because my husband is too drunk and too foolish to understand what he's done. Because sitting here waiting to die is not something I'm willing to accept. She paused, then added softly, and because if there's even a chance that David is the man people say he is, the man God has anointed to be king, then maybe, just maybe, he'll be willing to hear wisdom instead of satisfying wrath. Caleb nodded slowly, then moved to begin gathering the supplies. Abigail stood alone for a moment in the storage room, surrounded by the wealth her husband had hoarded, the abundance he had refused to share, the prosperity he valued more than wisdom or honour or basic human decency. And she made a decision that would echo through history, not because it was safe, not because it was certain to work, but because it was right, because wisdom demanded it, because sometimes the only thing standing between disaster and deliverance is one person willing to step into the gap. She turned and walked toward her chambers to change into travelling clothes, her heart pounding but her mind clear. Somewhere in the wilderness, David was arming his men and swearing vengeance, and Abigail was preparing to ride into the darkness to stop him. Chapter 4. David prepares for revenge. The messengers returned to David's camp as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The timing was significant. In the wilderness, you learned to measure your life by the light. Daylight meant visibility, safety, the ability to move and work and make progress. Darkness meant danger, vulnerability, the need to shelter and wait for dawn. But sometimes darkness could be a weapon. David's camp was situated in a narrow valley, protected on 3 sides by rocky outcroppings that made surprise attacks nearly impossible. Tents and rough shelters clustered around several central fires. Women worked at grinding grain, mending clothes, tending to the endless tasks that kept 600 people alive in hostile territory. Children played in the dust, their laughter a small defiance against the harshness of their circumstances. The men gathered as the messengers approached. You could feel the shift in energy, the way casual activity transformed into focused attention. These were warriors, even the ones who had never held a sword before joining David. The wilderness had trained them. Survival had honed them. They knew that messengers returning meant news, and news could be good or catastrophic with very little middle ground. Eliam, the lead messenger, walked straight to David without pausing. His face told the story before his mouth opened. This was not a man bringing good news. This was a man barely containing rage. David stood from where he had been sitting, reviewing maps with his commanders. He was 30 years old now, though the wilderness had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. His face was leaner, harder than when he had first fled Saul's court. His eyes carried the weight of responsibility for hundreds of lives that depended on his decisions. His hands, once smooth from playing the harp in Saul's presence, were calloused from weapons and hard work. "Tell me," he said simply. "He mocked you, sir." Eliam's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "Called you a runaway slave. Said you were nothing but a servant who broke away from his master. Asked why he should waste his resources on rabble from who knows where." The words landed like physical blows. Around David, his men went very still. You could hear the sudden silence, the way breathing changed, the subtle shift in posture that spoke of bodies preparing for violence. "We approached him with respect," Eliam continued. "We invoked the traditions of hospitality. We reminded him of what we'd done for his shepherds. We asked for whatever he could spare during a time of abundance, and he laughed at us, insulted you in front of his entire household, denied everything we've done, treated us like beggars who had no right to even speak to him." Another messenger stepped forward, a younger man whose anger was less controlled than Eliam's. "His own shepherds testified for us, sir. They told him how we'd protected them, how we'd kept them safe, how we'd asked for nothing, and he dismissed their words like they meant nothing, like the truth meant nothing compared to his arrogance." David's hand had moved to his sword, not consciously, but as a reflex, the way a body responds to threat before the mind has fully processed what's happening. His jaw was clenched so tight that muscles stood out along his neck. His eyes had gone cold in a way that his men recognized and respected, and, if they were honest, feared a little. "We protected his property for months," one of David's lieutenants said, stepping closer. The man's name was Joab, and he had been with David since the early days of exile. He was a fighter, a strategist, a man who understood violence and its applications. "We never took so much as a stray lamb. We drove off raiders who would have cost him hundreds of animals. We kept watch while his shepherds slept, and this is how he repays us. With insults and contempt." "He's grown fat on our protection," another man added. "Look at us. We're rationing food while our children go hungry. And he's throwing a festival, wasting enough resources to feed us all for months. He has everything because we gave him safety, and when we ask for basic hospitality, he spits in our faces." The voices were building, feeding off each other, the collective anger of men who had endured hardship and humiliation for too long. Men who had followed David into exile believing he was different from other leaders, better, more just. Men who had protected the weak and asked for nothing and maintained their honour even when it would have been easier to become bandits. And now they wanted blood. More than wanted it. They needed it. Because if you could insult David with impunity, if you could mock his men and suffer no consequences, then what did honour mean? What did service mean? Why maintain any standards at all when arrogance and cruelty went unpunished? David raised his hand, and the voices fell silent. When he spoke, his voice was cold and controlled, the tone of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it. "How many men are ready to fight?" Joab stepped forward immediately. 400, sir, armed and ready. We can move within the hour." "Good." David's eyes swept across the gathered men, and they saw something in his expression that sent a chill through even the veterans. This was not anger-seeking outlet. This was judgment being prepared. "Every man who can carry a sword straps it on now. We march as soon as we're assembled." "What are your orders, sir?" Joab asked, though he already knew. They all knew. David's voice was steady, clear, carrying to every man in the camp. "By the time the sun rises tomorrow, not one male will be left alive in Nabal's household. Not one. From the master who mocked us to the youngest servant who benefits from his wealth. Every single one. He wanted to know who I am. He'll know. He'll die knowing exactly who he insulted." The word sent a current through the camp. This was not a raid for supplies. This was not a tactical military operation. This was vengeance, pure and total. A wealthy man had humiliated a desperate leader in front of his men, and blood would pay for blood, life would pay for honour. Some of the men began moving immediately, retrieving weapons, checking equipment, preparing for the march. But others stood frozen for a moment, processing what they had just heard. Total annihilation. Women, children, servants who had done nothing wrong. All of them swept up in the coming violence. One of the older men, a veteran named Benaiah who had served in Saul's army before joining David, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, some of those people are innocent. The shepherds who testified for us. They tried to help. The servants, they have no part in their master's decision." David turned to face him, and Benaiah took an involuntary step back at the cold fury in his eyes. "They benefit from his wealth," David said. "They eat his food, live in his shelter, prosper from his success. And his success exists because we protected it. When he mocked us, when he denied us basic hospitality, they said nothing. They did nothing. They are part of his household, and his household has chosen to treat us with contempt. So his household will pay the price." The logic was harsh but not unfamiliar. In desert warfare, in tribal conflicts, in the kind of total war that defined the ancient world, households were units. You didn't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent when a family or a state had wronged you. You sent a message that could not be misunderstood. There are consequences for dishonour. There is a price for arrogance. Benaiah nodded slowly and stepped back. He didn't like it, but he understood it. More importantly, he understood that David's authority depended on this response. If they let this insult stand, if they swallowed this contempt and did nothing, they would be marked as weak. Other communities would refuse them. Other wealthy men would mock them. Their ability to survive in the wilderness depended on maintaining their honour, on ensuring that protecting people came with the expectation of reciprocity. David watched his men prepare with a mixture of satisfaction and something else. Something that might have been grief or regret, or the knowledge that he was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. He had been anointed to be king. Samuel had poured oil on his head and declared God's favour. The prophet had promised that he would rule Israel, that his dynasty would be established, that his throne would be secured. But that was then. That was before years of running from Saul, before living in caves and eating scraps and watching his people suffer, before the daily grind of survival pushed prophecy into the background and replaced it with the immediate necessities of staying alive. Right now, in this moment, he didn't feel like a future king. He felt like a desperate man who had been pushed too far, a leader whose honour had been shredded in front of his men, a warrior who needed to prove that there were consequences for contempt. The anger felt righteous, the violence felt justified. Every man in that camp understood it, felt it, agreed with it. Nabal deserved what was coming. His household deserved what was coming. Justice demanded blood. David checked his own weapons with practiced efficiency. Sword, knife, sling. The tools of his trade, the instruments of survival and warfare. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. His purpose was certain. Within the hour, 400 armed men were assembled. They moved out of the camp in practiced formation, warriors who had learned to fight together, to trust each other, to execute orders with efficiency. 200 men stayed behind to guard the camp, to protect the families, to maintain their position. The sun was setting as they began the march toward Nabal's estate. The sky turned red, then purple, then the deep blue of approaching night. The wilderness around them was vast and indifferent, marked by the passage of countless desperate men over countless desperate years. David marched at the head of his column, his face set, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, 400 men followed, ready to do whatever he commanded, ready to exact vengeance, ready to teach a lesson that would echo through the region for years to come. None of them knew that even now, in the darkness they were heading toward, a woman was preparing to meet them. A woman who would speak words they desperately needed to hear. A woman who would remind David of something he was in danger of forgetting. That the man God had chosen to be king needed to act like a king, even when everything in him wanted to act like a wounded warrior. The march continued. The darkness deepened. The distance to Nabal's estate grew shorter with every step. And somewhere ahead, riding through the same darkness on a desperate mission of mercy, Abigail was racing to intercept them before swords could be drawn and blood could be spilled, and a future king could stain his hands with vengeance that God's chosen should never commit. The gap between them was closing, and everything, absolutely everything, depended on whether she could reach them in time. Chapter 5. Abigail learns the truth. The supplies were gathered in silence that spoke of both efficiency and fear. Servants who had worked in Nabal's household for years moved through the storerooms with practiced knowledge, knowing exactly where everything was kept, exactly how to move quietly, exactly how to avoid attracting attention from the celebration that still raged in the courtyard. Bread first. Loaves that had been baked for the festival, golden and rich with oil, the kind of bread that spoke of abundance. Not the coarse barley bread of the poor, but wheat bread, finely milled, the bread you served to honoured guests. They gathered armfuls of it, enough to fill several large baskets. Wine next. Not the cheap wine you gave to workers, but the good wine from Nabal's personal stores. Dark, rich wine that had been aged in skins, wine that would command high prices in any market. They filled 5 large skins, each one heavy enough to require 2 men to lift. Then the sheep. 5 of them, already dressed and prepared for the festival roasting, their meat ready to be transported. This was wealth walking out the door, resources that Nabal had been hoarding for his own celebration, now being redirected to the very people he had just insulted. Roasted grain came next, sealed in clay jars to preserve freshness. Then clusters of raisins, sweet and concentrated, perfect trail food for men on the march. Finally, pressed cakes of figs, dense and nutritious, the kind of portable food that could sustain warriors for days. It was a king's provision, the kind of gift you gave to show honour, to demonstrate respect, to acknowledge service and build relationships. It was exactly what Nabal should have given freely, and had instead refused with contempt. Abigail supervised the loading personally, her mind calculating not just quantities but symbolism. This had to be enough to feed David's men well, more than well, generously. It had to demonstrate that someone in this household understood honour, understood gratitude, understood the obligations that service and protection created. But more than that, it had to be enough to make David pause, to make him think, to create a moment where vengeance might be interrupted by the sheer unexpected generosity of the gift. She had changed into travelling clothes, practical garments that would allow her to ride quickly without the encumbrance of the finer robes she usually wore. Her hair was braided back tightly, secured against wind and movement. She wore sturdy sandals, a simple head covering to protect against the night air, a cloak that would shield her from the cold that came to the wilderness after dark. Rachel brought her donkey, a strong animal known for its sure-footedness and speed. Not a beautiful creature, but reliable, the kind of mount you trusted when your life depended on it. "My lady," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you certain about this? The wilderness at night." is safer than this estate will be in a few hours if I don't go," Abigail finished. She placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Listen carefully. If anyone asks where I am, you know nothing. I took the supplies on my own authority. I made this decision. If things go badly, that needs to be clear. You followed orders, nothing more. And if things go well," Abigail managed a small smile, "then we'll all live to see the sunrise, which is more than we can hope for if I stay here and do nothing." Caleb approached, his face grave in the torchlight. "The supplies are loaded, my lady. The path is clear. But I have to ask one more time. Let us send guards with you, at least 2 men, for safety." "No," Abigail's voice was firm. "Armed men would only provoke what I'm trying to prevent. David is angry. He's leading warriors who are angry. If I arrive with guards, it looks like I'm expecting conflict. It suggests I think I need protection from him. That's the wrong message entirely. But my lady, you'll be alone, with 400 angry men." "I'll be alone with a man who was anointed by God to be king," Abigail said quietly. "At least that's what the stories say. That's what I'm choosing to believe. Because if those stories are true, if David really is who they say he is, then he'll listen to wisdom when it's offered. He'll hear truth even when he's angry. He'll be capable of being more than his rage demands." She paused, looking at Caleb intently. "And if the stories aren't true, if he's just another violent man using God's name to justify vengeance, then I'm dead whether I have guards or not, so I might as well go alone and hope for the best." Caleb nodded slowly, accepting the logic even if he didn't like it. "May God go with you then, my lady, and may he give you the right words when you need them." "That's what I'm praying for," Abigail said softly. She mounted her donkey, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. The pack animals were tied together in a line, ready to follow. The path ahead was dark, marked only by starlight and the pale glow of a rising moon. Behind her, the celebration continued. Music drifted through the night air. Laughter echoed off stone walls. Her husband's voice, loud and boastful, rose above the general noise. He was probably on his 5th or 6th cup of wine by now, his judgment completely clouded, his awareness of danger non-existent. Part of her wanted to go to him one more time, to shake him sober, to make him understand what he had done, what was coming, what was at stake. But she knew it would be useless. Nabal drunk was even more arrogant than Nabal sober. He would dismiss her concerns, mock her fears, maybe even prevent her from leaving if he understood what she was planning. No, this was her decision to make, her risk to take, her attempt to salvage what her husband's folly had endangered. She urged her donkey forward, and the small caravan began to move. The pack animals followed obediently, their hooves soft against the packed earth. Guards at the gate saw her leaving and nodded but said nothing. It wasn't unusual for her to handle estate business at odd hours. They had learned not to question her comings and goings. The estate fell behind her, its lights growing distant, its sounds fading. The wilderness opened up ahead, vast and dark and filled with unknown dangers. But Abigail kept moving, kept pushing forward, her heart hammering against her ribs but her hands steady on the reins. She prayed as she rode, not eloquent prayers like the ones the priests offered in the temple, not structured prayers following proper forms and formulas. These were the raw, desperate prayers of someone who had run out of human solutions and was throwing herself on divine mercy. Please let me find them before they reach the estate. Please give me words that will turn away wrath. Please let David be the man you've chosen, not just another warrior consumed by anger. Please, please, please. The path wound through rough country. Rocky slopes gave way to narrow valleys. Scrub brush caught at her clothing. Small animals scattered at her approach, their eyes glowing briefly in the moonlight before they vanished into the darkness. Time became strange in the wilderness. Minutes stretched into hours or compressed into moments. She had no way of knowing how far she'd come, how far she still had to go, whether she was even heading in the right direction. But she kept moving, because stopping meant giving up, because returning meant accepting death for her entire household, because somewhere ahead, David was marching toward vengeance, and she was possibly the only thing that could stop him. And then, As she rounded a bend where the path dropped into a narrow valley, she saw them, 400 men, moving like a dark river through the darkness. Torches burned at intervals, illuminating grim faces, drawn swords, the purposeful stride of soldiers heading toward battle. They filled the valley, a force that seemed both small and overwhelming, disciplined and barely controlled, righteous and terrifying. At their head rode a figure she recognized even at a distance. There was something about the way he carried himself, even in anger, that marked him as different. This was not just another wilderness fighter. This was not just another desperate fugitive. This was a man who had been chosen for something, who carried destiny like a cloak even when dressed in exile's rags. David. Abigail's breath caught. This was it. This was the moment. Everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes. She urged her donkey forward, directly into their path. The column slowed, then stopped. Hands moved to weapons. Eyes narrowed in suspicion and confusion. A woman, alone in the wilderness, leading pack animals, approaching an army in the middle of the night. It was unexpected enough to create uncertainty, and uncertainty in warriors meant caution. David raised his hand and the column halted completely. He watched Abigail approach, his expression unreadable in the torchlight. She could feel his anger, could sense the barely controlled fury radiating from him and his men. This was a moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one misplaced gesture, and everything could go catastrophically wrong. Abigail dismounted smoothly, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked forward, past the pack animals, past the supplies she'd brought, until she was standing directly in front of David's horse. And then she did something that would echo through history, something that would be remembered and discussed and debated for thousands of years, something that demonstrated wisdom beyond cleverness, courage beyond bravery, understanding beyond knowledge. She bowed, not a polite nod, not a respectful gesture, but a full prostration, her face to the ground, her body language speaking what words alone could never convey. Complete humility, total supplication, the posture of someone who recognized their absolute vulnerability and appealed not to rights or justice but to mercy. It was shocking. A woman of her status, the wife of a wealthy landowner, deliberately placing herself in the most vulnerable position possible before a man she'd never met. A man who was, by all accounts, coming to kill everyone in her household. Around her, David's men stood frozen. They had been expecting resistance. They had been prepared for conflict. They had steeled themselves for violence. This humble woman bowing in the dust. This was something none of them had anticipated. David's hand had moved to his sword, but now it paused. His expression shifted from fury to confusion to something else. Something that might have been curiosity or recognition, or the first crack in the armour of his rage. Abigail lifted her head just enough to speak, her voice clear in the night silence, carrying to every man who could hear. "Please, my lord, let the blame be on me alone. Let your servant speak to you, and hear what I have to say." It was a beginning, a doorway into possibility, a chance to speak truth before swords could be drawn and lives could be ended and choices could be made that could never be unmade. David did not tell her to leave. He did not order her removed. He did not dismiss her the way her husband had dismissed his messengers. He was listening. It was enough. It was everything. Abigail drew a deep breath, felt the words forming in her mind and heart, and began to speak the truth that would save her household, and though she could not know it yet, would save David's very soul. Chapter 6. The Quiet Intervention. The words came not from desperation alone, though desperation was certainly present. They came from something deeper, from wisdom earned through years of watching fools destroy what they should have protected, from nights spent wondering whether intelligence without power meant anything, from the accumulated understanding that sometimes the only weapon available is truth spoken at exactly the right moment. "My lord should pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal," Abigail said, her voice steady despite her position on the ground. "He is just like his name suggests. His name means fool, and folly goes with him wherever he walks. But I, your servant, did not see the men you sent." The opening was brilliant in its simplicity. She was immediately distancing herself from her husband's insult. She was acknowledging that what he had done was wrong, calling him wicked, calling him foolish, using his own name as evidence of his character. But she was also taking responsibility for what had happened, making herself the point of contact rather than forcing David to continue engaging with the insult Nabal had delivered. She was saying, "I understand why. You're angry. Your anger is justified. But let me explain. Let me give you context. Let me offer you something better than vengeance. Please forgive your servant's offence," she continued, rising slightly to her knees now, her eyes meeting David's directly. There was no fear in her gaze, only an intensity that demanded attention. "For the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live." The shift was subtle but profound. She had moved from addressing the immediate situation, Nabal's insult, David's anger, to addressing something much larger. She was speaking not to David the fugitive, but to David the anointed one, David the future king, David the man chosen by God for something greater than the wilderness and its desperate struggles. She was reminding him of who he was. More importantly, she was reminding him of who he was meant to become. "Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life," she said, and everyone listening knew she meant Saul, "the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God, but the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling." The reference to the sling was deliberate and powerful. Everyone knew the story of David and Goliath. Everyone knew how a young shepherd had faced a giant warrior and prevailed through faith and a simple weapon. Abigail was invoking that story, reminding David that God had delivered his enemies before and would do so again. He did not need to take vengeance into his own hands. He did not need to become the very thing he had fought against. David's expression was changing. The cold fury was still there, but something else was mixing with it now. Confusion, recognition, the first stirrings of doubt about the path he had chosen. Abigail pressed forward, sensing the opening, knowing that this moment would not last forever. "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, or of having avenged himself with his own hands." There it was, the heart of her argument, delivered with perfect clarity. She was not saying David couldn't kill Nabal. He absolutely could. 400 armed men against an estate full of civilians. The outcome was certain. She was not saying Nabal didn't deserve it. By the laws of honour and desert justice, his insult had earned severe consequences. She was not invalidating David's anger, or dismissing his grievance, or suggesting his response was unreasonable. Instead, she was asking him to think beyond this moment, to consider not just what felt justified right now, in the heat of rage, but what he would carry with him tomorrow, next year, for the rest of his life. She was asking him to think like a king. Kings had to consider consequences beyond the immediate. Kings had to carry the weight of decisions long after the moment of choosing had passed. Kings had to live with the knowledge of every life they had taken, every choice they had made, every action they had authorized, and killing innocent people because their master had insulted you. That was not the action of a king. That was the action of a warlord, a bandit, a man who let anger override wisdom. Abigail was offering David a way out, a path where he could maintain his honour without staining his hands with blood he would regret forever. A choice where he could be strong without being destructive, just without being vengeful, righteous without being cruel. "And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success," she concluded, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, "remember your servant." The final request was whispered. "Remember me. Remember this moment. Remember the woman who rode into the darkness to save you from yourself." The silence that followed was profound and complete. 400 men stood motionless, watching their leader, waiting to see how he would respond. The torches flickered. The night air was cold. The wilderness stretched out around them, vast and indifferent. David sat on his horse, his face illuminated by the dancing flames, his expression shifting through emotions too complex and too fast to catalogue. Anger was there, still burning, still demanding satisfaction. But other things were present too. Shame, recognition, the dawning realization of what he had almost done. He had been so certain, so convinced that violence was the answer, that justice demanded blood, that his honour required vengeance. The anger had felt righteous. The cause had seemed clear. The solution had appeared obvious. And then this woman had stepped into his path and spoken truth that cut through rage like light through darkness. She had not told him he was wrong to be angry. She had acknowledged his anger as justified. She had not said Nabal didn't deserve punishment. She had called him wicked and foolish to his face. She had not invalidated his feelings or dismissed his grievance, or suggested he should simply accept the insult and move on. Instead, she had reminded him of who he was meant to become, what God had promised him, and what that meant for how he chose to act in this exact moment. She had given him permission to be greater than his anger, to choose wisdom over wrath, to act like the king he would someday become rather than the desperate fugitive he currently was. David dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. His men tensed, unsure what was happening, hands moving unconsciously to weapons. But David's hand was not on his sword. It was extended, reaching down to help Abigail to her feet. She took his hand and rose, meeting his eyes directly. In that moment, something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, a shared acknowledgement that they had both just been saved from catastrophe. When David spoke, his voice carried to every man who could hear, loud and clear and filled with emotion that had nothing to do with anger. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. The words were a confession, an admission, a public acknowledgement that what was about to happen had been wrong and that he had been saved from committing it. Chapter 7. Wisdom that disarms anger. David stood facing Abigail, and everyone watching could see the transformation happening in real time. The cold fury that had driven him through the wilderness was draining away, replaced by something that looked like relief mixed with horror at what he had almost done. "May you be blessed for your good judgment," he continued, his voice thick with emotion that he was not trying to hide, "and for keeping me from bloodshed this day, and from avenging myself with my own hands." He turned to address his men, and they saw something in his face they hadn't seen in months. Not the hunted fugitive, not the desperate leader trying to keep his people alive through cunning and force, but the man who had stood before Goliath with nothing but faith and a sling, the man who had sung psalms in Saul's court, the man who had been anointed to be king, the man God had chosen. "Look at what almost happened here tonight," David said, his voice carrying to the back ranks. "Look at what we were about to do. We were going to kill everyone in Nabal's household. Every man, every boy, servants who had done nothing wrong, workers who had testified on our behalf, children who didn't even understand what their master had done." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We would have told ourselves it was justice. We would have called it righteous anger. We would have said that Nabal's insult demanded this response, and we would have been lying to ourselves." Some of the men shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "This woman," David continued, gesturing to Abigail, "has shown me what I was in danger of forgetting. That being chosen by God means acting like it. That being anointed for kingship means thinking like a king, not like a wounded warrior. That justice and vengeance are not the same thing, no matter how much our anger wants to pretend they are." He looked back at Abigail, and his expression was one of profound gratitude mixed with something like awe. "Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." The confession was complete. He was admitting publicly and without equivocation that he had been wrong, that his course had been disastrous, that without this intervention he would have committed an act that would have haunted him for the rest of his life. It was an extraordinary moment, leaders, especially ancient leaders, especially warriors, did not typically admit error, did not confess mistakes, did not acknowledge that their judgment had been flawed. Pride demanded otherwise. Authority required the appearance of infallibility. But David was secure enough in his real authority, the authority of God's anointing, that he could afford to be humble, could afford to admit when he was wrong, could afford to thank someone for saving him from himself. He turned to Joab, his lieutenant. "The supplies?" Joab gestured to the pack animals Abigail had brought. In the torchlight, the men could see what she had carried through the wilderness. Bread, wine, dress sheep, roasted grain, raisins, fig cakes, a feast. The kind of provision that spoke of honour and respect and generous hospitality. Everything Nabal should have given and had refused. "Accept them with gratitude," David said. "Distribute them equally among the men. We feast tonight not in celebration of vengeance, but in gratitude for deliverance. We thank God for sending someone with the wisdom to stop us from becoming something we would have hated." He looked at Abigail one final time, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, more personal. "You have saved more than your household tonight. You may have saved my very soul. You reminded me of who I am and who I'm meant to become. You gave me back something I was in danger of losing. My conscience, my honour, my ability to be the man God chose, rather than just another violent warrior consumed by rage." Abigail bowed again, less deeply this time, acknowledging his words. "Then perhaps we have saved each other, my lord. You in choosing to listen, me in having the courage to speak. God works through both the speaking and the hearing. We were both necessary for this moment." David nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words. Then he raised his voice to address his men. "We return to camp. The march is over. The vengeance is cancelled. We go back different men than we set out. Wiser, humbler, more aware of how close we came to disaster." The column began to turn, the energy completely transformed. Men who had been tense with anticipation of violence now moved with something like lightness. They had been given permission to be themselves again, to be good men rather than instruments of revenge, to maintain the honour they had worked so hard to preserve rather than throwing it away in a single night of bloodshed. As they passed Abigail, several of them nodded to her, their expressions speaking gratitude they could not put into words. They understood what she had done, understood that she had saved them as much as she had saved her household, because they were not killers at heart. They were men trying to survive in impossible circumstances, men trying to maintain their dignity in the face of constant humiliation, men trying to believe that honour still mattered even when the world seemed designed to reward cruelty and punish goodness, and they had come very close to becoming exactly the kind of men they despised. The kind who killed innocent people to satisfy wounded pride, the kind who let anger override wisdom, the kind who confused strength with brutality. Abigail had saved them from that, had reminded them that they were better than their worst impulses, had given them back the possibility of being men of honour rather than men of blood. Joab approached David as the column reformed. "Sir, should we send scouts back to watch Nabal's estate in case he tries something?" David shook his head. "No, he's drunk and foolish, but he's not a warrior. He poses no threat beyond his words, and his words have already done all the damage they can do. Let him live with the consequences of his own folly." "What consequences? We're letting him go unpunished." David smiled grimly. "Are we? Think about it. He insulted us, yes, but he also revealed himself to his entire household. His shepherds know he refused to honour men who protected them. His servants know he treated desperate people with contempt. His wife just demonstrated more wisdom and courage than he'll ever possess. His reputation is ruined. His honour is shredded, and he doesn't even know it yet because he's too drunk to understand what happened." He paused, then added thoughtfully, "Sometimes the worst punishment is simply being revealed for what you are. Nabal will face consequences, just not from us." The march back to camp was quiet, contemplative. Men walked with their thoughts, processing what had happened, what had almost happened, what they had learned about themselves and their leader. David rode near the front, his mind turning over Abigail's words. He had been so close, so very close to crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, to staining his hands with innocent blood, to becoming a man who let anger override conscience, and he would have been able to justify it. That was the terrifying part. He could have told himself it was justice. He could have convinced himself that Nabal's household deserved what they got. He could have rationalised it 100 different ways, but it would still have been murder. It would still have been wrong, and it would have stained everything that came after, every decision he made, every claim to righteousness he might want to assert. He thought about the future Abigail had invoked, about being king, about ruling Israel, about sitting in judgment over others. How could he judge fairly if he carried the guilt of innocent blood? How could he claim moral authority if he had let anger drive him to atrocity? The anointing Samuel had given him was not just about power. It was about responsibility, about being the kind of man who could lead a nation, who could make wise decisions, who could be trusted with authority because he understood its limits and its obligations. Tonight, he had almost failed that test, almost proven that he was not ready, not worthy, not capable of being what God had called him to be. But Abigail had given him another chance, had reminded him of who he was meant to become, had shown him that true strength sometimes looked like restraint, that real justice sometimes required patience, that the mark of greatness was not in the ability to destroy enemies but in the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary and when it was simply rage dressed up as righteousness. He would not forget this night, would not forget the woman who had ridden into darkness to speak truth, would not forget how close he had come to losing something far more important than his honour, his very soul. The camp appeared in the distance, fires burning against the darkness, home, such as it was, safety, such as it could be, life continuing in the wilderness one day at a time, one choice at a time. David dismounted and stood for a moment, looking back the way they had come. Somewhere out there, Abigail was riding back to her husband's estate, back to the drunk, fool who had no idea how close he had come to annihilation, back to a life that must be difficult beyond imagining, married to a man like that. He made a decision in that moment. If anything ever happened to Nabal, if circumstances ever freed Abigail from that miserable marriage, he would send for her, would offer her a place of honour, would make sure that the woman who had saved his soul never had to live under the authority of fools again. It was the least he could do, the very least. He turned and walked into the camp where his men were already distributing the food Abigail had brought. There would be enough for everyone, a feast just as he had promised, not in celebration of vengeance but in gratitude for wisdom. And somewhere in the wilderness between David's camp and Nabal's estate, a woman rode alone through the darkness, her mission accomplished, her household saved, her courage validated. She had stepped between anger and violence and spoken truth, and the truth had set everyone free. Chapter 8. David Listens. The feast in David's camp that night was unlike any they had experienced in the wilderness, not because the food was extraordinary, though Abigail's provisions were far better than what they usually ate, not because of any special celebration, though there was certainly relief in the air. It was different because of what it represented. Men sat around fires, passing bread and wine, sharing the roasted grain and pressed figs that Abigail had brought. The dressed sheep were divided carefully, ensuring everyone received a fair portion. Children who had gone to bed hungry too many nights ate their fill. Women who had rationed everything for months could finally relax and enjoy abundance, however temporary. But the real feast was the conversation, the processing of what had happened, the collective working through of emotions that range from relief to shame to gratitude. "I was ready to kill them," one man admitted quietly, staring into his fire. All of them. Didn't matter who they were, what they'd done. They were part of Nabal's household, and that was enough. I had already decided they deserved what was coming. "We all had," another replied. "That's what makes it so frightening. It wasn't just David who was ready for blood, we all were. We'd convinced ourselves it was justice." An older man, one who had seen actual war before joining David, spoke up. That's how it always starts. You tell yourself a story about why violence is necessary, why your enemies deserve what's coming, why innocent people are actually complicit just by association, and if you tell yourself that story enough times, you start to believe it. So what stopped us? A younger fighter asked. Why did we listen to her? We could have just ridden past, could have told her to get out of the way, could have done what we set out to do. David, sitting slightly apart from the main groups but close enough to hear, stood and walked toward the fire. The conversations quieted as men turned to listen to their leader. We listened, David said, because somewhere deep inside we knew she was right. We knew what we were planning was wrong, even if we didn't want to admit it. Her words didn't convince us of something new. They reminded us of something we already knew but were trying to ignore. He sat down among them, not above them, and continued. I've been thinking about this, about how easily we went from justified anger to planned massacre, about how quickly righteousness turned into something ugly and vicious, and I think I understand what happened. The men leaned in, wanting to hear, wanting to understand their own near disaster. We've been living in the wilderness for months, David said, running from Saul, struggling to survive, watching our families suffer. We've done everything right. We've maintained our honour. We've protected the weak. We've refused to become bandits. And what has it gotten us? Hunger, hardship, constant danger. Heads nodded. Everyone knew this reality intimately. And then Nabal insults us, after we protected his property, after we asked for nothing but basic hospitality, after we did everything the right way. He mocks us, calls us slaves and rabble, treats us like we're worthless. David's voice was tight with remembered anger, but also with understanding. That hurt. Not just because it was insulting, but because it felt like confirmation of something we've been afraid of, that honour doesn't matter, that doing the right thing doesn't make any difference, that we're suffering for nothing. The silence was profound. He had articulated something they had all felt but couldn't name. So when he insulted us, David continued, we didn't just want revenge for the words. We wanted revenge for everything, for all the suffering, for all the hardship, for all the times we've done the right thing and gotten nothing but trouble for it. Nabal became the symbol of everyone who had ever wronged us, everyone who had ever dismissed us, everyone who made us feel worthless. And we were going to make him pay, someone said quietly. We were going to make him pay, David agreed. We were going to hurt him so badly that no one would ever dare treat us that way again. We were going to prove that we mattered, that we had power, that insulting us came with terrible consequences. He paused, then added softly, we were going to become exactly what Saul always claimed we were. Violent, dangerous, unpredictable, men who couldn't be trusted with power because we'd use it to hurt anyone who crossed us. The weight of those words settled over the camp like a physical presence. But Abigail stopped us, David said. Not with force, not with threats, with wisdom. She reminded us that we're better than our worst impulses, that being chosen by God means something, that future kings don't slaughter innocent people to satisfy wounded pride. He stood again, looking around at his men. Here's what I learned tonight. Real strength isn't about being willing to use violence. It's about being able to choose not to use violence when every part of you wants to. True power isn't destroying your enemies. It's being able to show mercy when you have every right to seek vengeance. One of the younger men spoke up. But sir, doesn't that make us look weak? If people think they can insult you without consequences. Let me answer that, David said firmly. What happened tonight will be talked about. Nabal's shepherds saw what he did. His servants know what he said. And soon they'll learn that 400 armed men were coming to destroy them, and that we turned back because one woman spoke wisdom. He let that sink in. Which story makes us look stronger? That we slaughtered innocent people because their master insulted us? Or that we were wise enough to listen to truth, strong enough to control our anger, and secure enough in our authority that we could show mercy without fear? The second one, someone said slowly, because the first one just makes us look like bandits. But the second one makes us look like actual leaders. Exactly, David said. Bandits kill to prove they're dangerous. Leaders show restraint to prove they're strong. We're not bandits. We never were. and we won't become them now." The conversation continued long into the night. Men talked about what they had learned, what they had almost become, what Abigail's intervention had meant. The food was distributed fairly, consumed gratefully, appreciated not just for its substance but for what it represented. Meanwhile, David sat alone for a time, thinking about the future, about kingship, about the kind of ruler he wanted to become, about the lessons that came from unexpected sources. Abigail had been right about everything. If he had killed Nabal's household, it would have haunted him forever. Every time he sat in judgment as king, every time he claimed moral authority, every time he tried to lead with wisdom, that one night of vengeance would have undermined everything. "Sir?" David looked up to find Joab standing nearby. "I just wanted to say thank you for listening to her, for having the courage to change course. I know how hard that must have been, with all of us ready for blood, with your honour at stake, with everything screaming for vengeance." David nodded slowly. "You know what was hardest? Admitting she was right, admitting I was wrong, standing in front of all of you and confessing that I had led us toward disaster. That's what made it powerful," Joab said. "You're strong enough to admit error. That's rare, sir. That's the kind of thing that makes men willing to follow you into anything." After Joab left, David sat alone under the stars, thinking about a woman riding through the wilderness, about courage that looked like bowing in the dust, about strength that manifested as wisdom rather than violence. He thought about Nabal, drunk and oblivious, completely unaware of how close he had come to death, completely unaware that his wife had just saved his life, completely unaware that he was now living on borrowed time, his reputation shredded, his household knowing exactly what kind of man he was. David felt no satisfaction in Nabal's continued existence, no frustration that the man who had insulted him would face no immediate consequences, just a kind of profound relief that he had not become a murderer of innocent people, that his soul remained unstained, that he could still look at himself and see someone worthy of God's anointing. Tomorrow they would wake up to the same struggles, the same hunger, the same danger, the same uncertain future. Nothing had changed about their circumstances, but everything had changed about David, about his understanding of leadership, about his grasp of what it meant to be chosen by God for something greater than survival. He had been tested tonight, not by an external enemy, not by Saul's pursuit, not by the hardships of the wilderness. He had been tested by his own anger, his own wounded pride, his own capacity for vengeance, and he had passed the test. Not because he was strong enough on his own, but because he had been humble enough to listen when wisdom spoke. That was the real lesson. That was what he would carry forward. That was what Abigail had taught him. The greatest battles aren't always fought against external enemies. Sometimes they're fought against yourself, against your worst impulses, against the voice that tells you violence is the answer, that vengeance is justice, that power means never having to show restraint. And sometimes, just sometimes, God sends someone to help you win those battles. Someone willing to speak truth, someone brave enough to interrupt your anger, someone wise enough to remind you of who you really are. David looked up at the stars, the same stars that had shone on the night he had been anointed by Samuel, the same stars that had witnessed his victory over Goliath, the same stars that would someday shine over his kingdom. "Thank you," he whispered into the night. "Thank you for sending her. Thank you for saving me from myself. Thank you for reminding me that being chosen means choosing wisely." The stars offered no answer, but somewhere in the darkness, a woman was returning to her husband's estate, and the night was filled with the quiet miracle of violence prevented, wisdom honoured, and souls preserved. Chapter 9. Consequence without revenge. Abigail returned to find the celebration still raging. If anything, it had intensified in her absence. The courtyard blazed with torches that threw dancing shadows across stone walls. Music pounded through the night air, drums and flutes playing the kind of increasingly sloppy rhythms that spoke of musicians who had consumed too much wine. Servants rushed back and forth with more food, more drink, their faces flushed with exhaustion and perhaps their own secret drinking. and at the centre of it all sat Nabal, more drunk than Abigail had ever seen him. His face was red and swollen. His words were slurred. His movements were uncoordinated, his gestures broad and meaningless. He was holding court to a dwindling audience. Most of the important guests had already left, leaving only the hangers-on and sycophants who had nowhere better to be. Abigail slipped through the crowds unnoticed. In the chaos of the celebration, one more person moving through the courtyard drew no attention. She returned the pack animals to their pens, ensured they had water and feed. The servants who had helped her gather supplies were nowhere to be seen. They had made themselves scarce, knowing that questions might be asked and that the less they knew, the safer they would be. She made her way to her chambers, removed her travelling clothes and changed into nightwear. Her body ached from the ride, from the tension, from the adrenaline that was finally draining away now that the crisis had passed. Her hands were shaking slightly, delayed reaction to what she'd just done, to how close everything had come to disaster. She could hear the celebration continuing outside, Nabal's voice shouting something incomprehensible, laughter, breaking pottery. Someone had dropped or thrown something. The sounds of excess, of waste, of celebration without purpose or meaning. Abigail lay down but did not sleep, could not sleep. Her mind kept returning to the wilderness, to David's face in the torchlight, to the moment when fury had transformed into relief, to the knowledge that 400 men had been moments away from committing an act that would have haunted them forever. She had done it. Somehow, impossibly she had done it. She had ridden into darkness and spoken truth to power and changed the trajectory of destruction. But the night was not over. She still had to face her husband, still had to tell him what had happened, still had to make him understand how close he had come to death, how his wife had saved him, how his arrogance had nearly destroyed everything. So she waited for the celebration to wind down, waited for the last guest to stumble away, waited for her husband's inevitable collapse into drunken stupor. The sounds gradually faded, the music stopped, voices grew quieter, then silent. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the estate was finally still. Abigail rose, washed her face, dressed in simple day clothes. She moved through the quiet household, past servants who were already beginning the massive clean-up from the night's excess. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some of them suspected something had happened, but none of them knew what. She found Nabal in the main hall, exactly where she expected. He was slumped in his chair, his expensive robe stained with wine and food. His mouth was open, snoring audibly. The hall stank of wine and sweat and the aftermath of overindulgence. Abigail had a servant bring water and bread, the traditional remedy for terrible hangovers. Then she waited. She sat in the hall, watching the sun rise through the windows, watching her husband gradually surface from his drunken sleep. It took hours. The sun was well up, the day growing warm, before Nabal finally stirred. He groaned, clutched his head, squinted against the light. His face was pale now, the ruddy flush replaced by the greyish-green pallor of someone seriously regretting their previous night's choices. "Water," he croaked. Abigail brought it to him personally. He drank deeply, grimacing at the taste, his hand shaking so badly that water sloshed onto his robes. "What time is it?" he muttered. "Late morning," Abigail said calmly. "The celebration went very late." "Good celebration," Nabal said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "Showed everyone, showed them what real success looks like." "Yes," Abigail agreed. "You certainly showed them something." Something in her tone made him look up sharply, though the movement clearly hurt his head. "What do you mean by that?" "I need to tell you something," Abigail said, her voice level and controlled. "About what happened yesterday. About the messengers who came from David. Those beggars, I sent them away, taught them a lesson about respect." "You did teach them a lesson," Abigail said. "You taught them that Nabal of Maon values his pride more than his life, that he would rather insult desperate men than honour those who protected his property, that he considers himself too important to follow basic traditions of hospitality. Nabal's eyes narrowed, even through the pain of his hangover. "What are you talking about?" Abigail sat down across from him, her posture straight, her voice steady. "After you dismissed David's messengers with insults, David armed 400 men and marched on our estate. He swore by God that by morning every male in this household would be dead. Every man, every boy, everyone who benefits from your wealth. All of us. Dead." The words penetrated slowly through the fog of Nabal's hangover. His face, already pale, went even paler. His hands, already shaking, began to tremble more violently. That's not possible." "It's completely possible," Abigail said. "I heard what you did. I heard the insults you delivered, and I knew exactly what would happen, so I took matters into my own hands." "You... what?" "I gathered provisions from our storehouses. Bread, wine, sheep, grain, raisins, figs. Everything your messengers should have brought to David when he asked. Everything you should have given freely but refused out of arrogance. I loaded it all onto pack animals, and I rode out alone to meet David before he could reach our estate." Nabal was staring at her now, his mouth hanging open, his bloodshot, eyes wide with shock and dawning comprehension. "I met him in the wilderness," Abigail continued, her voice never wavering. "He was coming with 400 armed warriors. They had their swords drawn. They were ready to kill everyone here, and I bowed before him. I took responsibility for your offence. I appealed to his better nature, reminded him of who he is and who he's meant to become. I asked him to spare us. You had no right." "I had every right," Abigail said sharply, all the fear and anger and frustration of the night finally breaking through her controlled exterior. "I had the right of someone trying to save lives. I had the right of someone married to a fool who was too drunk to understand what he had done. I had the right of someone who actually cares whether innocent people live or die." Nabal tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed back into his chair, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "David listened to me," Abigail said, pressing her advantage. "He thanked me. He blessed me for my wisdom. He said I had kept him from bloodshed and from avenging himself with his own hands. He turned his entire army around and went back to the wilderness, because of me, not because of you. You were here, drunk and celebrating, completely unaware that death was coming, while I was in the wilderness, risking my life to save yours." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something more intense, more personal. "You insulted a man anointed by God to be king. You mocked warriors who protected your property. You violated every tradition of hospitality and honour, and your wife had to fix what your arrogance broke." Nabal's face had gone from pale to grey. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing. His breathing was coming in gasps now, shallow and quick. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the coolness of the hall. You took my property. You gave it to that outlaw." "I saved your life," Abigail said flatly. "I saved everyone's lives. And yes, I used your precious property to do it, because apparently your wealth is more important to you than the lives of everyone in this household." Nabal was clutching at his chest now. His face had taken on a strange, frozen quality. His breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. Abigail stood quickly. "Someone get a physician," she called. "Now!" Servants came running. They helped Nabal to a couch, loosened his robes, tried to help him breathe, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. His whole body had begun to shake. His eyes rolled back. His skin took on a bluish tinge. The physician arrived and examined him quickly. "His heart," he said quietly to Abigail. "The shock, the fear. It's too much for him. My lady, I don't think—" "Do what you can," Abigail said. But she already knew it was too late. Nabal was dying, not from David's sword, but from fear, from the sudden realization of his own mortality, from the weight of consequences he had never believed would actually come. He had not been struck down by an enemy. He had not been killed in battle. He had been undone by the truth, by the knowledge that his arrogance had brought disaster, that his wife had saved him from destruction he deserved, that he had been completely powerless and completely wrong. For 10 days, Nabal lingered. His body became like stone, paralysed, unable to move or speak. He lay in his bed, his eyes staring at the ceiling, his mind presumably trapped in the horror of what had happened, what he had done, what he had almost caused. Abigail tended to him during those days, not out of love. She had never loved him. Not out of duty alone, though duty played a part, but out of a kind of mercy that he had never shown to anyone else. She ensured he was clean, comfortable, that physicians did what they could. She sat with him sometimes, though she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. On the 10th day, his heart finally gave out completely. Nabal died without ever speaking another word, without ever acknowledging what had happened, without ever understanding that his wife's wisdom had been worth more than all his wealth. The household mourned appropriately, but without deep grief. Nabal had not been loved. He had been endured. People showed respect for the dead because that's what you did, but there were no tears, no genuine sorrow, no sense of real loss. They buried him in the family tomb with all appropriate ceremony. Wealthy men came to pay their respects, though several of them privately remarked on how fitting it was that Nabal had died from his own arrogance, rather than from any external attack. Abigail stood by the grave and felt empty, not glad, not sad, just empty. She had saved him from violence only to watch him destroy himself from within. She had given him a chance to change, to learn, to become something better than what he was. But some people cannot change. Some people are so locked into their own arrogance that even deliverance feels like an attack. She turned from the grave and walked back toward the house. She was a widow now, technically free, though freedom in the ancient world for women was always conditional, always limited. She would need to figure out what came next, whether to stay in this household that held so many difficult memories, whether to return to her family, whether to build some new life from the ashes of the old. She did not know that David had already heard of Nabal's death, did not know that he was, at that very moment, sending messengers to her with an offer that would change her life again. She knew only that she had done what was right, had spoken when silence would have been easier, had acted when inaction would have been safer, had stepped between anger and violence and spoken truth that saved lives. In a world of cruelty and vengeance, that was its own kind of victory. Not the victory of seeing your enemies destroyed, but the quieter, deeper victory of knowing you had maintained your integrity, honoured wisdom, chosen life over death. She walked back to the house, her head high, her conscience clear, and in the distance, messengers were already riding toward her with news that would begin the next chapter of her remarkable life. Epilogue, the strength of peace. The messengers from David arrived 3 weeks after Nabal's burial. They came formally, respectfully, bearing a request that made the entire household hold its breath and exchange wondering looks. David, son of Jesse, the anointed future king of Israel, was asking Abigail to become his wife. It was not entirely unexpected, though it was still surprising. Everyone knew that David had been impressed by her wisdom. Everyone had heard the stories, somewhat embellished with each telling, of how she had ridden into the wilderness and turned back an army with nothing but words. Everyone understood that she had demonstrated qualities that any wise leader would value. But still, a marriage proposal from David himself. The request was carefully worded, showing the same respect that had characterized their first meeting. It acknowledged Abigail's recent widowhood, gave her full freedom to refuse, and made clear that this was an offer, not a demand. David was not trying to acquire her as property or add her to a collection. He was asking her to partner with him, to bring her wisdom and courage to his household, to stand beside him as he waited for God's promises to unfold. Abigail considered the offer carefully. She was under no illusions about what life with David would mean. More hardship in the wilderness, continued danger from Saul's pursuit, uncertainty about the future, sharing a husband with other wives. David was already married to Michal, Saul's daughter, though they were separated by circumstances, and he would likely marry others for political and practical reasons. But she also understood what the offer represented, a chance to escape the legacy of Nabal's foolishness, an opportunity to use her gifts in service of something greater than managing an estate, a partnership with a man who had demonstrated the capacity to listen to wisdom, to change course when shown a better path, to value truth over pride. She accepted. The marriage was simple, conducted in David's wilderness camp with his men as witnesses. There was no grand celebration, no elaborate ceremony, just the binding of two lives together, the mutual commitment to support each other through whatever came next. And what came next was everything the stories had promised and more. Abigail stood beside David through the final years of Saul's pursuit. She counselled him when anger threatened to override wisdom. She reminded him of who he was meant to become when circumstances tempted him toward expedient rather than righteous choices. She helped manage the complex household of a man with multiple wives, mediating conflicts, smoothing tensions, ensuring that personal drama did not undermine collective survival. When Saul finally fell in battle and David was crowned king, first over Judah and then over all Israel, Abigail was there. She saw him take the throne she had referenced that night in the wilderness. She watched him establish his kingdom, deal with enemies, administer justice, build something lasting from years of struggle. And David never forgot what she had taught him, never forgot the night when a woman's courage had saved him from becoming a murderer, never forgot that true strength sometimes looked like restraint, that real power sometimes manifested as wisdom rather than force. Throughout his reign, whenever anger threatened to drive him toward vengeance, he would remember Abigail, would remember her bowing in the dust, would remember her words about not carrying the burden of needless bloodshed, would remember that being chosen by God meant acting like it. He was not perfect. David's reign was marked by both brilliance and catastrophic failures. He would sin grievously, would fail spectacularly, would make decisions that brought devastating consequences. But he never forgot the lesson Abigail had taught him, that wisdom guided by faith could interrupt destruction before it began. The story of that night in the wilderness became part of his legend. Not the famous stories, not his defeat of Goliath, or his victories in battle or his accomplishments as king, but the quieter story of how he had been saved from himself, how a woman's courage had preserved his soul, how wisdom had triumphed over wrath. Abigail lived to see David's kingdom established, to see the promises God had made beginning to unfold, to see the man she had stopped from committing atrocity become the greatest king Israel would know. She bore him a son, gave him counsel that shaped his reign, stood as evidence that sometimes the greatest warriors need to be saved from their own strength. Her legacy was not in monuments or military victories. It was in a single night when she had ridden into darkness to save people who didn't even know they needed saving. When she had spoken truth that changed a future king's heart. When she had proved that wisdom guided by faith can stop destruction before it ever begins. The story would be told and retold for thousands of years. In synagogues and churches, in late-night conversations and formal teachings, in moments when people needed to remember that peace is not weakness, that restraint is strength, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step between anger and violence and say, wait, think, remember who you are. Because that is what Abigail did. She remembered who David was when he was in danger of forgetting. She saw the king in the desperate fugitive. She recognized the man chosen by God in the warrior consumed by rage. She spoke to his best self when his worst self was demanding satisfaction, and he listened. That is the real miracle, not that she spoke, but that he heard, not that she offered wisdom, but that he had the humility to receive it, not that she interrupted his anger, but that he let himself be interrupted. In a world that celebrates strength and power, that honours the ability to crush enemies and dominate opposition, their story offers something different, something quieter but infinitely more powerful. It offers the possibility that we can choose peace, that we can let anger go, that we can listen to wisdom even when it comes from unexpected sources, that we can be saved from ourselves if we're willing to hear truth when it's offered. Abigail's legacy is not in the violence she prevented, though that alone would be significant. Her legacy is in what she proved about the power of wisdom, the strength of restraint, the possibility of peace. She showed that you don't need an army to stop a war. You need courage, you need wisdom, you need the willingness to speak truth to power, to step into danger for the sake of others, to appeal to the better nature of someone consumed by their worse impulses. And David showed that true strength means being able to change direction when shown a better path. That real power includes the power to show mercy. That being chosen by God means acting like someone who understands that might does not make right, and that vengeance, however justified it feels, carries costs that echo through eternity. Together, they demonstrated something the world desperately needs to learn and relearn, that wisdom guided by faith can interrupt violence before it begins. That peace is not the absence of conflict, but the active choice to transform conflict through truth and courage and the willingness to appeal to the best in people rather than assuming their worst. May we all have such strength when our moment comes. May we all be willing to ride into darkness and speak truth to power. And may we all be humble enough when wisdom comes to meet us to stop and listen and let ourselves be saved from our own worst impulses. That is the lesson of Abigail. That is the gift she gave David. That is the hope she offers us all thousands of years later in a world that still struggles with the same questions about anger and justice, about vengeance and mercy, about when to fight and when to pursue peace. Peace is not weakness. It is wisdom in action. And sometimes it is the bravest thing anyone can choose. Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been? Whether it's evening where you are, or perhaps the middle of the night, or even early morning on the other side of the world, you're so welcome here. What time is it in your corner of the world right now? And where are you listening from tonight? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet countryside, in the mountains or by the ocean, you belong in this peaceful space we're creating together. If this is your first time with us, welcome to our community of seekers finding rest in ancient wisdom. And if you're returning, thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these moments of peace and reflection that we share together. Now let's settle in as we travel back to ancient Israel, to a time of prophets and miracles, to discover a story about trust, provision, and the surprising ways that hope can multiply in our darkest hours. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty village streets, but Miriam barely noticed its warmth. She stood in the doorway of her small stone house, watching her 2 young sons sleep on their woven mats, their faces peaceful in the golden light. For a moment she allowed herself to pretend that everything was as it had been before the illness took her husband, before the debts mounted like stones upon her chest, before the collectors began their visits with increasingly stern voices and hardening faces. But pretending was a luxury she could no longer afford. The sound of approaching footsteps made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She knew that measured pace, those heavy sandals against the packed earth. The debt collectors had returned, and this time she knew they would not leave empty-handed. Miriam's husband, Obadiah, had been a good man, a servant in the school of prophets, devoted to following Elisha and learning the ways of the Lord. But goodness, she had learned, did not always translate to prosperity. When the drought had stretched on for months, when the harvest had failed, Obadiah had borrowed money to keep food on their table and oil in their lamps. He had been certain that better times were coming, that the Lord would provide as he always had. Then the fever came, swift and merciless, taking Obadiah before the rains returned, before the debts could be repaid, before he could see his sons grow into men. Now 3 men stood at her threshold, their faces grim with business. The lead collector, a man named Josiah with calculating eyes and soft hands that had never known hard labour, stepped forward. "Miriam, widow of Obadiah," he announced formally, though they all knew each other's names in this small village. "The time for payment has come and gone. Your husband's debts must be settled." Miriam's throat felt as dry as sand. "Please, I have explained our situation. I am a widow with nothing. Give me more time, and I will find a way." "Time is a luxury that costs money," Josiah interrupted, his voice neither cruel nor kind, simply matter-of-fact. "We have been patient, but patience does not feed our families, or pay our own obligations. The law is clear about what must be done when debts cannot be paid." Behind him, the other 2 men shifted uncomfortably. They knew what came next, and while they might not relish it, they would not hesitate to carry out what the law demanded. "Your sons," Josiah continued, his eyes flicking toward the doorway where the boys still slept. "They will come with us. 7 years of service will settle your husband's debt. It is more merciful than we are required to be." The words hit Miriam like a physical blow. She gripped the door frame to keep from falling, her knuckles white against the worn wood. 7 years. Her sons were only 8 and 10 years old. By the time they returned, they would be grown men who barely remembered their mother's face. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, please. They're all I have left. There must be another way." But even as she spoke, she knew the futility of her words. She had nothing of value to offer. No jewellery, no livestock, no land. The house itself belonged to her husband's brother, who had graciously allowed her to remain but could offer no financial help of his own. "I will give you until tomorrow morning to say your goodbyes," Josiah said, and there was perhaps the smallest note of sympathy in his voice. "We will return at sunrise." As the men walked away, their sandals raising small clouds of dust that caught the morning light, Miriam sank to her knees in the doorway. The weight of hopelessness pressed down upon her like a stone, threatening to crush what little breath remained in her lungs. Her sons stirred behind her, waking to another day they assumed would be like all the others. Simple, poor perhaps, but together. How could she tell them that their childhood was about to end? How could she explain that the law that was meant to protect would now tear their family apart? But as the sun climbed higher, and the reality of her situation settled like dust around her, Miriam remembered something her husband used to say when times were difficult. "When we have nowhere else to turn, we can always turn upward." Obadiah had learned this truth in his years following the prophet Elisha, and even in death, his faith whispered to her across the veil of grief. Elisha. The prophet was still in the region, still teaching and performing the wonders that had made him famous throughout Israel and beyond. If anyone could help her, if anyone might know a way where there seemed to be no way, it would be the man of God who had been her husband's teacher and guide. Miriam rose to her feet, dust falling from her simple brown robe. She looked back at her sons, now awake and eating the last of their bread, with the unconscious contentment of children who trust that tomorrow will somehow provide for itself. "Aaron, Micah," she called softly, "I must go into the village. Stay close to home and watch out for each other." The boys nodded, accustomed to their mother's brief errands, unaware that she was about to embark on a journey that would either save their family or confirm their worst fears. As Miriam walked through the village streets, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The prophet Elisha was known to be staying with a family on the far side of the village, and with each step she rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain their desperate situation without sounding like she was demanding a miracle. But by the time she reached the modest house where Elisha was lodging, all her carefully planned words had evaporated like morning dew. She stood at the gate, paralysed by the enormity of what she was about to ask and the crushing possibility that even a prophet might not be able to help her. The courtyard was quiet except for the gentle murmur of voices from within the house. Miriam could see Elisha through the open doorway, seated on a low cushion with several young men gathered around him, students perhaps, or local villagers seeking wisdom. His presence was immediately recognisable, not because of any physical grandeur, but because of a quality of stillness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a hearth. Miriam had seen the prophet before, of course. In a village this small, everyone knew when such a significant figure was present. She had watched from a distance as people brought their sick children for healing, their troubled hearts for counsel, their impossible situations for divine intervention. But she had never imagined herself among their number, never thought her own need would drive her to such a desperate act. A woman emerged from the house, evidently the hostess, and noticed Miriam standing uncertainly at the gate. "Can I help you, sister?" the woman asked kindly, but there was a protective quality in her voice. She had probably dealt with many people seeking the prophet's attention. Before Miriam could answer, Elisha's voice came from within. "Let her come. The Lord has brought her here for a reason." The woman's expression immediately softened, and she gestured for Miriam to enter. "Come, the prophet will see you." Miriam's legs felt unsteady as she crossed the threshold. The young men who had been listening to Elisha's teaching respectfully moved aside, creating a space for her to approach. The prophet's eyes, kind but penetrating, met hers, and she felt as though he could see not just her present desperation, but the entire story of her life written in her face. "You're Obadiah's widow," Elisha said gently. It was not a question. Miriam nodded, surprised that he knew her by sight. "Yes, my lord. I am Miriam. Your husband was a faithful servant, both to the Lord and to this community. His loss has been felt by many." Elisha's words were spoken with genuine warmth. Miriam felt tears prick at her eyes, partly from grief that was still fresh, partly from gratitude that someone remembered her husband's worth. "Thank you, my lord," she managed, "but I have come because—" The words stuck in her throat like thorns. How did one ask a holy man to solve what seemed unsolvable? "Speak freely, daughter. What troubles you?" The kindness in his voice broke through her restraint like water through a cracked dam. The whole story poured out. The debts, the collectors, the threat to take her sons, the sunrise deadline that loomed like an executioner's blade. She spoke of her husband's faithful service, of their family's long devotion to the Lord, of her complete bewilderment at how faithfulness could lead to such devastating circumstances. When she finished, the courtyard was silent except for the distant sound of children playing in another street, a sound that reminded Miriam acutely of what she stood to lose. Elisha listened without interruption, his expression grave but not hopeless. When she fell silent, he sat quietly for a moment, as though listening to a voice only he could hear. Finally he spoke. "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The question caught Miriam off guard. What did she have? The very essence of her problem was that she had nothing. No money, no valuables, no resources with which to pay her debts, or provide for her family. "Nothing, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nothing at all." But Elisha's gaze remained steady, patient. "Look again. What do you have in your house?" Miriam searched her memory, walking through their small home in her mind. A few pieces of simple furniture, some clay pots, worn clothing, sleeping mats. Nothing of any value. Certainly nothing that could solve a debt large enough to require 7 years of servitude to repay. Then she remembered. There is a small jar of olive oil," she said hesitantly. "Just a little. Barely enough for a few meals." She almost apologized for mentioning something so insignificant, but the prophet's face had changed. There was something in his expression now, not quite a smile, but a kind of quiet intensity that made the air in the courtyard feel charged with possibility. "A jar of oil," Elisha repeated thoughtfully. "How much oil?" "Very little, my lord. Perhaps enough to fill a cup, no more." The prophet nodded slowly, as though this small detail was exactly what he had been hoping to hear. He stood up, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "Here is what you must do," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke not just his own words, but those of the Almighty. "Go to all your neighbours, not just the ones nearby, but throughout the village. Ask them to lend you their empty jars and vessels. Don't ask for just a few. Collect as many as you can carry." Miriam blinked in confusion. Empty jars? What good would empty vessels do when her problem was that she had nothing to fill them with? "I don't understand, my lord. If I had oil to fill jars, I would not be in this position." "Understanding comes after obedience, not before," Elisha said, but his tone was gentle, not reproving. "Trust in the Lord's provision, even when his ways seem strange to our human reasoning." He continued with his instructions. "When you have gathered the empty vessels, go into your house with your sons. Close the door. This miracle is not for the curious eyes of the neighbours, but for the desperate faith of a mother. Then take your small jar of oil and begin to pour." "Pour into what, my lord?" "Into the empty jars. Pour until they are full." The instructions seemed impossible, even absurd. How could she pour from a nearly empty jar into multiple vessels? The physical laws that governed their world simply didn't work that way. But as Miriam looked into the prophet's eyes, she saw something that gave her pause. Not madness, not delusion, but absolute certainty. This was a man who had seen the impossible become routine, who had learned to expect miracles the way others expected sunrise. "Do you trust me?" Elisha asked simply. Miriam thought of her sons, sleeping peacefully this morning while she faced the possibility of never tucking them in again. She thought of her husband's faith, unwavering even in illness, even in poverty, even at the end. She thought of the alternative, doing nothing, accepting defeat, watching her children be led away at sunrise. "Yes, my lord, I trust you." "Then go. The Lord will not fail you." As Miriam prepared to leave, one of the young men who had been listening spoke up. "Master, shouldn't we accompany her?" "Help her carry the vessels." But Elisha shook his head. This work must be hers alone. Faith cannot be borrowed or carried by another. It must be exercised by the one who needs the miracle. Walking back through the village streets, Miriam felt as though she were in a dream, or perhaps more accurately, as though she had just awakened from the nightmare of the past few months into a reality where impossible things might be possible. The prophet's instructions echoed in her mind: collect empty jars, as many as possible, then pour from her nearly empty vessel into them. It made no earthly sense. But then again, neither did most of the stories she had heard about Elisha and his master Elijah before him. Prophets who had called down fire from heaven, raised the dead, and fed multitudes with meagre supplies. Perhaps the very impossibility of the instruction was itself a sign that she was about to witness something beyond the natural order. Her first stop was at the house of her neighbour Sarah, an elderly woman who had been kind to Miriam since Obadiah's death, often sharing vegetables from her garden when she had none to spare. "Sarah," Miriam called softly at the gate, "may I speak with you?" The older woman emerged, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Of course, child. You look different somehow. Is everything well?" Miriam almost laughed at the question. Nothing was well, and yet somehow everything felt different than it had this morning. "I need to ask a favour. Do you have any empty jars or vessels that I might borrow?" Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. Empty jars? Whatever for? How could Miriam explain without sounding like she had lost her mind? "The prophet Elisha has given me instructions. I need to gather as many empty containers as I can." To her credit, Sarah didn't ask for further explanation. In a community where prophets occasionally walked among them, people had learned that divine instructions often defied human logic. "I have several clay jars that I use for storing grain, but they're empty now since the harvest was so poor. You're welcome to them. Let me help you carry them." As they loaded the vessels into Miriam's arms, Sarah's expression grew concerned. "Miriam, the whole village knows about your situation with the debt collectors. If there's anything else I can do—" "Pray," Miriam said simply. "Pray that the Lord remembers his promises to care for widows and orphans." Her next stop was at the home of Rebecca. a woman with several children who had always been friendly but not particularly close. Here, Miriam felt more nervous about making her request. "Rebecca, I know this will sound strange, but I need to borrow any empty jars or pots you might have." Rebecca looked puzzled but not unfriendly. "Empty jars? Are you planning to store something? I heard about your troubles. Surely you're not thinking of buying oil or grain?" "No, nothing like that. The prophet Elisha has asked me to collect empty vessels. I'm not entirely sure why, but I trust that he knows what he's doing." At the mention of Elisha's name, Rebecca's demeanour changed immediately. "The prophet gave you instructions? Of course, take whatever you need." "Children," she called into the house. "Bring out all the jars and pots we're not using, quickly now." Soon Miriam's arms were full again, and Rebecca's children were helping to carry the additional vessels. Word seemed to be spreading through the village. She could see neighbours emerging from their houses, curious about the unusual activity. By the time she reached the house of David the potter, she didn't even need to make her request. He was already waiting with an armload of clay vessels, not his finest work, but good serviceable jars in various sizes. "I heard you were collecting empties on the prophet's instructions," he said with a grin. "I've got plenty of these. Consider it my contribution to whatever miracle is about to happen." "You really think there will be a miracle?" Miriam asked, suddenly feeling the weight of what she was attempting. So many people were now involved, so many witnesses to what would either be a tremendous demonstration of God's power or a devastating display of her own foolishness. David's expression grew serious. "I've lived in this village for 40 years, and I've seen 3 different prophets pass through. Not once have I seen one of them give instructions that didn't lead to something remarkable. The real question isn't whether there will be a miracle, it's whether we'll have enough faith to receive it." As Miriam continued through the village, she was amazed by the response. People she barely knew were offering their vessels, and those who had no jars to spare were spreading the word to others who might. Children ran ahead of her, announcing to each household what was needed. Even some of the village elders, usually stern and cautious about anything that disrupted the normal order, were nodding their approval and contributing what they could. By mid-afternoon, Miriam's small house was surrounded by more clay vessels than she had ever seen in one place. There were large storage jars that could hold enough oil for a family for months, medium-sized pitchers perfect for daily use, and small vessels suitable for lamps and cooking. Some were beautifully crafted, others rough and practical. Some were new, others showed the wear of years of faithful service. Her sons, Aaron and Micah, had awakened to find their home transformed into something resembling a pottery merchant's stall. They helped carry the vessels inside, their eyes wide with excitement and confusion. "Mother, what are all these for?" Aaron asked. At 10, he was old enough to sense that something significant was happening, but young enough to find it more exciting than frightening. "We're going to fill them," Miriam said, the words sounding even stranger when spoken aloud to her children. "Fill them with what?" 8-year-old Micah wanted to know. Miriam looked at the small jar of oil sitting on their simple wooden table, the same jar she had mentioned to the prophet, containing perhaps a cup's worth of precious olive oil. It looked impossibly small, surrounded by all the empty vessels now crowding their one-room home. "With oil," she said, and saw her sons exchange the kind of look children give when they're certain their parent has said something that makes no sense but are too polite to argue. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Miriam stood in her doorway one last time before following the prophet's final instruction. The village around her looked the same as it had this morning, but everything had changed. This morning she'd been a desperate woman with no options. Now she stood on the threshold of either a miracle or a disaster. But at least she was no longer passive in the face of her circumstances. She could see a few neighbours lingering in their own doorways, clearly curious about what would happen next. News of the prophet's instructions had spread throughout the village, and while no one was bold enough to ask for details, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as though the entire community was holding its breath. Tomorrow morning the debt collectors would return, expecting to claim her sons. But tonight belonged to faith, to the impossible, to the hope that a God who had parted seas and raised the dead might still care about one widow's desperate prayer. "Come, boys," she said, stepping back inside their small home. "It's time to close the door." The interior of their small house felt different with the door closed and the outside world shut away. The late afternoon light filtered through the single window, casting long shadows among the collection of empty vessels that now filled nearly every available space. Aaron and Micah stood close to their mother, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary, though they couldn't possibly understand what. Miriam picked up the small jar of oil with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear now, but from anticipation. The prophet had been so certain, so confident in his instructions. But looking at the meagre amount of oil in her jar compared to the dozens of empty vessels surrounding them, she felt the weight of impossibility settling over her like a heavy cloak. "Mother," Aaron said quietly, "how can we fill all these jars with so little oil?" It was the question that had been echoing in her own mind, but hearing it from her son's lips made her realize that this moment was about more than just solving their financial crisis. Her children were watching, learning what it meant to trust when trust seemed foolish, to obey when obedience seemed pointless, to hope when hope seemed dead. "I don't know how, my son," she said honestly, "but the prophet told us to pour, so we will pour. Sometimes we must act on faith before we understand the reason." She moved to the largest jar first, a beautiful vessel that David the potter had contributed, large enough to hold oil for several months. As she lifted her small jar and positioned it over the opening, she whispered a prayer. "Lord God of Israel, you who cared for the widow of Zarephath, in the days of Elijah, remember your servant and his children." The oil began to flow. At first it seemed natural. The golden liquid poured from her jar into the larger vessel, with the normal splash and gurgle of any liquid being transferred. But as seconds passed, then minutes, Miriam realized that something impossible was happening. The oil continued to flow, steady and smooth, and yet when she looked at her own jar, it appeared as full as when she'd started. "Mother," Micah whispered, his young voice filled with awe, "it's still coming." The first large jar filled completely, rich golden oil reaching its brim. Miriam looked at her own vessel, still full. Her hands began to shake, not with fear now, but with the overwhelming realization that she was witnessing the divine intervention of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "Bring me another jar," she said, her voice barely steady. Aaron quickly positioned a medium-sized pitcher beside her, and Miriam continued to pour. Again the oil flowed freely, filling the second vessel completely, while her own jar remained miraculously replenished. "Another," she said, and now her voice carried a note of growing excitement. Micah dragged over a small storage jar, and the process repeated. The oil flowed, the vessel filled, and still her small jar remained full to the brim. As they continued, a rhythm developed. The boys would position each new vessel, Miriam would pour until it was full, then they would move it aside and bring the next one. With each jar they filled, their excitement grew, and what had begun as nervous obedience transformed into joyful celebration. "It's not stopping," Aaron laughed, no longer trying to whisper in the presence of miracle. "Mother, it's really not stopping." Miriam found herself laughing too, tears of relief and wonder streaming down her face as she poured jar after jar. The oil continued to flow, inexhaustible, impossible, absolutely real. This was the God her husband had served, the God who had parted the Red Sea and provided manna in the wilderness, and he was here in their small house, multiplying oil for a desperate widow and her children. The sun set completely as they worked, and Aaron lit their oil lamp, using oil from one of the newly filled jars. The warm light danced across the growing collection of filled vessels, each one a testament to divine provision, each one a step away from the disaster that had threatened to destroy their family. They filled the large storage jars first, then the medium pitchers, then the smaller vessels for daily use. Oil for cooking, oil for lamps, oil for anointing, oil for trade. More oil than their family could use in a year, more than they could use in several years. "Mother," Micah said during a brief pause, "will we ever run out of empty jars?" Miriam looked around their home. They had filled perhaps half of the vessels they had collected, and still the oil flowed freely from her small jar. "I hope not, my son. I hope we never run out." But even as she spoke, she realized they were approaching the end of their supply of empty containers. Only a handful of vessels remained unfilled, the smallest ones suitable for perfumes and medicines. As she filled the second-to-last jar, a delicate little vessel that Rebecca had contributed, Miriam felt a change. The oil still flowed, but there was something different in its quality, as though it was beginning to recognize that its work was nearly complete. She reached for the final jar, the smallest one in the collection, barely large enough to hold oil for a single lamp. As she positioned her small jar above it and began to pour, the oil flowed out in a steady stream, filling the tiny vessel to its brim. And then, as suddenly as the miracle had begun, it stopped. Miriam tilted her jar, trying to coax out even a few more drops, but it was empty. Completely, naturally, normally empty, as though the laws of physics had suddenly remembered themselves and returned to their usual operation. The silence that followed was profound. For hours their small house had been filled with the sound of flowing oil, excited whispers, and occasional exclamations of wonder. Now, surrounded by dozens of filled vessels, they stood in the golden lamplight and absorbed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Aaron was the first to speak. "Is it over?" Miriam looked at her empty jar, then at the abundance surrounding them. "Yes, my son, it's over because we have no more empty vessels to fill." "What does that mean?" Micah asked. Before Miriam could answer, she remembered something the prophet had implied in his instructions. The miracle was not limited by the amount of oil God could provide, but by the amount of faith they could exercise, represented by the number of empty vessels they had been able to gather. "It means," she said slowly, understanding dawning on her like sunrise, "that God's provision is only limited by our capacity to receive it. If we had gathered 100 jars, he would have filled 100 jars. If we had gathered 1,000... The implications took her breath away. They had gathered many vessels, yes, but now she wondered, could they have gathered more? Had their own limited vision constrained the miracle? It was a question that would follow her for the rest of her life, a reminder to always ask for more, expect more, prepare for more when seeking God's intervention. But such thoughts were for later reflection. Tonight, surrounded by the tangible evidence of divine love and provision, there was only gratitude and wonder. "Tomorrow," she told her sons as they prepared for sleep among the filled vessels, "we will go to the prophet and then to the marketplace. We will sell this oil, pay our debts, and secure our future." As her boys settled onto their sleeping mats, their faces glowing with excitement and the security of knowing they would not be taken away, Miriam sat beside the window and looked out at the village where she had lived her entire life. Tomorrow she would no longer be known as the desperate widow who had nothing. She would be the woman whom God had remembered, the mother whose children had been saved, the recipient of a miracle that would be told and retold for generations. But tonight she was simply a woman who had learned that emptiness was not the absence of provision, but the presence of possibility, and that sometimes the most important thing you can bring to God is not what you have, but what you lack. The oil lamps flickered gently in the darkness, fueled by the miracle oil casting dancing shadows on the walls of their transformed home, and in the quiet of the night, Miriam whispered prayers of thanksgiving to the God who multiplies hope in the hands of those who dare to pour out their faith, one empty jar at a time. Morning came with a gentle golden light that seemed especially bright as it streamed through the window of their small house. Miriam awakened to a sight that confirmed the previous evening had not been a dream. Dozens of clay vessels filled with rich golden olive oil crowded every surface and corner of their home. Aaron and Micah were already awake, sitting among the jars with expressions of continued amazement, as though they expected the oil to disappear with the sunrise. "It's still here," Aaron said wonderingly. "All of it." "Did you think it wouldn't be?" Miriam asked, though she understood his disbelief. Miracles had a quality of unreality about them, even to those who experienced them directly. "I dreamed about it," Micah said. "I dreamed that we were pouring oil forever and ever, and there were jars as tall as trees, and the oil turned into rivers that flowed through the whole village." Miriam smiled at her younger son's imagination, but then paused to consider his words. "In a way, Wasn't that exactly what had happened? The oil had flowed beyond their immediate need, beyond their ability to contain it all, beyond what seemed possible in their small, constrained world. A knock at their door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window she could see the familiar figure of Elisha standing in their courtyard, his presence as calm and assured as it had been the day before. "The prophet," Aaron whispered excitedly. Miriam quickly adjusted her headscarf and opened the door, her heart racing with anticipation and gratitude. "My lord," she said, bowing respectfully, "please, come in and see what the Lord has done." Elisha entered their transformed home, his eyes taking in the abundance with what appeared to be satisfaction, but not surprise. This was clearly not the first time he had witnessed the Lord's provision in response to desperate faith. "It is well," he said simply, then looked directly at Miriam. "Tell me what happened." Though he had given the instructions and surely knew what to expect, Miriam realized he wanted to hear her testimony, to let her put into words the miracle she had experienced. So she told him everything: the gathering of vessels, the closing of the door, the first hesitant pour, the growing amazement as jar after jar filled with oil that seemed to come from an inexhaustible source. "We filled every vessel we had collected," she concluded. "When the last jar was full, the oil stopped flowing." Elisha nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you understand from this?" The question surprised her. She had expected congratulations, perhaps instructions for what to do next, but not an examination of her theological understanding. I understand that the Lord remembers his promises to care for widows and orphans," she said slowly, "and that his provision is beyond what we can imagine or contain." "Yes," Elisha agreed. "And what else?" Miriam thought about the experience, about the rhythm of pouring and filling, about the moment when the oil finally stopped. "The miracle was limited only by our preparation," she said with growing insight. "If we had gathered more vessels—" "The oil would have continued to flow," Elisha confirmed. "God's provision is not constrained by scarcity, but by our capacity to receive abundance. Remember this lesson and teach it to your sons." He moved toward the door, then turned back with final instructions. "Now go. Sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons will live on what remains." "How much should I sell?" Miriam asked, suddenly practical concerns rushing back as she realized she had no experience as a merchant. "Take the oil to the marketplace in portions. Don't flood the market all at once, or you'll drive down the price. Sell slowly, over time, and you'll receive full value. The Lord has given you not just provision for today, but wisdom for managing tomorrow." After the prophet left, Miriam stood in her doorway watching his retreating figure until he disappeared around a corner. Then she turned back to face her transformed reality. The first practical task was obvious. She needed to begin transporting oil to the market. But first there was another matter to address. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. 3 familiar figures were walking down her street, the debt collectors, returning as promised at sunrise to claim her sons. But this time Miriam felt no fear, no desperate helplessness. She stood calmly in her doorway, watching their approach with something approaching pity for men who lived in a world too small to contain miracles. "Miriam," Josiah called as they drew near, "are you prepared to surrender the boys?" "I am prepared to pay the debt," she replied evenly. The 3 men stopped walking, clearly taken aback by her confident tone. "Pay the debt?" Josiah repeated skeptically. "Yesterday you claimed to have nothing. What has changed overnight?" "The Lord has provided," Miriam said simply. "I now have the means to settle my husband's obligations in full." She gestured toward her house, where several of the oil jars were visible through the open doorway. Olive oil of the finest quality, more than enough to cover what is owed, with plenty remaining for my family's future needs. The debt collectors exchanged glances, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. "Where did you get oil?" one of them asked suspiciously. "You cannot simply produce valuable goods from nothing." "With the Lord, nothing is impossible," Miriam replied. "But if you doubt the quality or value, you are welcome to examine it for yourself." Josiah stepped forward and peered into the house, his eyes widening at the sight of dozens of filled vessels. He dipped his finger into the nearest jar and tasted the oil. his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. "This is premium oil," he admitted reluctantly, "worth far more than your husband's debt." "Then we are agreed," Miriam said. "I will deliver payment to you within 3 days once I have sold sufficient oil in the marketplace." The 3 men departed, shaking their heads in bewilderment, leaving Miriam alone with her sons and their miraculous abundance. Over the following weeks, Miriam carefully sold portions of the oil at the market, following Elisha's wise counsel. The oil was of such exceptional quality that merchants competed to purchase it, and word spread throughout the region about the widow's premium product. True to her word, she paid her husband's debts in full within the promised time, but the oil continued to provide for their family month after month, year after year. She was able to purchase their house from Obadiah's brother, expand their small business, and ensure her sons received proper education. Aaron and Micah grew into strong, faithful men who never forgot the night they witnessed their mother pour from an empty jar and receive abundance beyond measure. They told the story to their own children and grandchildren, how God had multiplied oil in the hands of a desperate widow who dared to trust when trust seemed impossible. Years later, when Miriam was an old woman surrounded by prosperity and family, people would ask her about the secret of her success. She would always smile and say, "The miracle was not in the oil that multiplied, but in the faith that dared to pour from an empty jar. God is not limited by what we lack. He's only limited by our willingness to bring him our emptiness and trust him to fill it." And in the evenings, when the oil lamps flickered in homes throughout the village, many still burning oil that traced its origins back to that miraculous night, the people would remember that sometimes the greatest abundance comes not when our jars are full, but when we have the courage to pour from what little we have, trusting that the God who created the universe from nothing can certainly create provision from our emptiness. The widow's oil became more than a solution to debt. It became a testament to the truth that faith, like oil, multiplies when poured out in trust, and that the God who notices empty jars is the same God who delights in filling them beyond our wildest dreams. For in the end, Miriam learned the most important lesson of all. We bring our emptiness to God not as a sign of our failure, but as an invitation for his abundance. And when we dare to pour out our faith, even from the smallest jar, we discover that his provision knows no limits except those we place on our own capacity to receive. The story of the widow's oil echoed through generations, a reminder that in the hands of the Almighty, even our deepest need can become our greatest testimony to his faithfulness.